Hello, and welcome to this clean historical Western romance by Martha Gillcrest. It's great to have you with us. Before we begin, be sure to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple way allows us to share more heartwarming romance stories with you for free. Now, get cozy, relax, and escape into adventure and love with a host of new characters. Enjoy. The following book is the copyright of Martha Gillcrest. Charity's Last Chance for Love by Martha Gillcrest. Chapter 1. New York, April 1880. Charity, must you behave in such an unseemly manner? Mary Cuthbert drew herself up to her full height and swept into the kitchen like a galleon ship in full sail. Her plump cheeks quivered with indignation as she took in the scene which greeted her. I turn my back for 5 minutes, and you're inviting every waif and stray of New York into our home. Really, dear, I know we must fulfill our duties to help the poor, but does it need to involve groveling on the floor like this? Charity pushed her lustrous brown curls back from her face and looked up from where she was kneeling on the floor. She had several pairs of her old shoes scattered around her and was fitting them onto the grubby feet of the child who sat on the seat in front of her. It's so wet outside, Mama, and I saw this little girl at the corner of the street with no shoes. I have more than I know what to do with. You're ever so generous, miss. I ain't never had shoes this good in all my life. The girl gave Mary a gap-toothed grin before wiping her nose on her ragged sleeve, leaving a smear of something Mary would rather not have seen. The sooner Theodore announces a date for your wedding, the better. Mary gave a dramatic shudder and stepped further away as the girl started to vigorously scratch her scalp. She wafted her lace handkerchief in front of her, hoping the child hadn't infested them all with head lice. I'm quite happy living at home, Mama. Surely there's no need to rush into marriage, is there? Perhaps after Theodore has completed the tour of Europe, he's always talking about might be a better time to consider an engagement, if that's what he has in mind. Mary's cheeks flushed with impatience as she heard the reluctance in her daughter's comment. Charity stood up and took the little girl's hand, making her stand up and do a twirl. The smart black shoes looked incongruous at the end of her thin, scabby legs that peeked out from below the tattered hem of her dress. Are you hungry, little one? I expect Bessie can spare some bread and cheese. Hold up a moment, and I'll get some for you before you leave. I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. We're certainly not waiting until after his trip to Europe for Theodore to declare his intentions, Mary replied, speaking over the girl. Her tone brooked no argument, and she turned on her heel and hurried toward her parlor. A moment later, she was penning a letter to Mr. and Mrs. Russell, inviting them and their son to dinner the following week. If she had to hurry Theodore along with a little encouragement and a reminder to the Russells of what a good catch Charity was, it would be a small price to pay to see her headstrong elder daughter safely married. She wondered briefly why he was taking so long, trying to ignore the thought that he might be dallying with Charity's affections, with no intention of getting married. Did someone say my name? Bessie Parks bustled into the kitchen, carrying a tray of teacups. Are you giving away our food again, Charity? Bessie gave her an indulgent smile as she caught sight of the bulging cheeks of the street urchin as she scampered down the steps toward the gardener who had been instructed to escort her back to the orphanage. I knew you wouldn't mind. Charity flopped down on a chair and gave their housekeeper a guilty glance. Mercy, Bessie. There's so much poverty in this city. I try to help, but Mama just wants me to get married and fritter away my days taking luncheon with the other society ladies. It's so dull I could scream. It's admirable that you want to help, Charity, but a young woman of your station in life is expected to do what their parents say. But it's so unfair, Bessie. Charity's face clouded as she poured herself a cup of tea from the fine bone china teapot Bessie had placed in front of her. Why can't I be more like Theodore? He wants to travel to Europe, and he gets to work at his father's business. All I've got to look forward to is endless social engagements. Are you complaining again? Fiona Cuthbert wandered into the kitchen to join her sister. Bessie dunked a cloth in a bowl of warm water and handed it to Fiona with a wry smile. You might want to wipe the paint off your face before your father sees it. I'm not complaining, Fiona, just commenting on how unfair it is that Theodore can enjoy all the adventures he likes and young ladies like us can't, just because of what other folks might think. She screwed up her nose and gave an irritated huff of frustration. Fionn shrugged and turned to peer into the gleaming surface of a saucepan to see her reflection before wiping the telltale smudge of paint from her cheek. Well, if you will agree for Mama to marry you off to one of the most eligible bachelors of the neighborhood, you can't really complain. Agree? Charity sipped her tea gloomily. I'm not sure I had any choice. Papa decided it would be good for his business for me to marry into the Russell family, and that's that. Bessie put a fresh cup of tea in front of Fiona. There was only a year between the sisters, and she had known them all their lives. She gave them a fond look. She would certainly miss them both once they were married and had families of their own. The sisters' antics had kept her entertained for years, despite Mrs. Cuthbert's attempts to turn them into genteel young ladies. Charity had inherited the dark-eyed good looks of Mary and was determined to help as many of the city's orphans and paupers as possible. Whereas Fiona had the pale complexion and blue eyes of their father, Robert Cuthbert, and had plans to become a great artist if only her father would agree. I wouldn't mind, but Theodore is so boring, Charity muttered. I truly think all those adventures are wasted on him. Her eyes took on a faraway, dreamy look, and she rested her chin on her hands. I thought love was about being swept off my feet and wooed with flowers and meaningful glances in the moonlight. Fiona giggled at her sister's flights of fancy. I reckon Theo sees you as a useful business investment, more like, with our pa importing tea and his pa owning one of the biggest mercantile businesses on the East Coast. It's a match made in heaven. She laughed louder as Charity poked her tongue out at her. Don't tease your sister, Bessie scolded. Marriage is rarely about such romantic notions as you've described, she added, giving Charity a regretful shrug. It is if you fall in love with an artist, like I have, Fiona replied, flushing pink. Bessie and Charity turned to stare at her. What do you mean? Charity demanded hastily. You don't know any artists, so how can you have fallen in love with one? That's where you're wrong, dear sister, Fiona giggled. When I did the painting course at the Academy for Young Ladies, the artist who taught us watercolor was positively dreamy. Mr. Rosen said my paintings were the best in the class. I've already asked Papa if he can come and give me some private lessons, and he's agreed. Charity's mouth gaped open as she thought about what Fiona had just told her. Mama will be horrified if she thinks you're throwing your life away swooning over some penniless artist. Fiona waved her sister's concerns away. As far as Mama is concerned, improving my art is just something to do until she can find me someone as eligible as Theodore to marry. But while she's distracted with your wedding plans, I do believe I might have a very enjoyable few months while Mr. Rosen falls head over heels in love with me. It's so romantic I can hardly sleep at night thinking about it. She jumped up and waltzed around the kitchen table, imagining herself in George Rosen's arms. I really don't think that's a good idea, Miss Fiona. Bessie shook her head as she paused in kneading the bread dough in front of her. She had a bad feeling about this, and for once she was on Mary Cuthbert's side. Except it wasn't Charity they needed to worry about. It was the usually sensible Fiona who would be getting herself into a whole heap of trouble and bringing the family name into disrepute if they didn't look out. Chapter 2. Fiona twisted the final curl of Charity's hair around the brush, letting the ringlet fall softly onto her sister's shoulder, and stood back to admire her handiwork. If Theodore doesn't make a formal announcement of your engagement tonight, I'll have to shake some sense into him myself, she declared. Charity met her glance in the mirror of the dressing room they shared with a raised eyebrow. You've made me look lovely as usual, Fiona, but I'd rather Theodore wanted to marry me because he adores every part of me, not just because I'm in a pretty dress. Fiona grinned and fluttered her eyelashes in the mirror. The pale lilac of her gown matched her eyes, and she did a gentle curtsy to her reflection. Why, thank you, George. I would be delighted to have this next dance with you. She lifted her arms and began a slow waltz between the polished mahogany dressing table and the closet that housed all their gowns, before throwing herself onto the chaise longue with a giggle. "If only George was really coming to the dinner party tonight," she said wistfully. "He'd liven things up a bit. Instead, we'll have to listen to Papa talking business with Mr. Russell and Theodore." She yawned loudly before dissolving into laughter as she imagined what Mr. Russell's face would be like if he knew how hard Fiona had to fight not to yawn when he was droning on about his business. It's better than listening to Mrs. Russell's interminable stories of who was wearing what at the last fundraising event she went to. Charity fastened a velvet choker around her neck, giving herself one last cursory look in the mirror. She knew that if she didn't look her best, her mother would suspect she was trying to derail the engagement. If George was with us tonight, we would be talking about the latest art exhibitions at the Louvre in Paris, or how to capture the light in someone's eyes in a picture of beauty forever. "I'm not sure Papa would entertain that sort of conversation," Charity replied. "He would want to know whether the paintings were a good business investment." "That's just it," Fiona burst out, looking suddenly cross. "An artistic talent like George's doesn't come down to money. It's about how it makes you feel." She sat up and shot Charity an intense look. "I think I might be very much in love with George, you know. When I think about him, I can't sit still. I feel as though my heart wants to leap out of my chest when he stands next to me to correct a brushstroke." "You have to stop this nonsense," Charity said hastily. "There's no point pretending that Mama and Papa would ever agree to you and George marrying. If you allow yourself to fall in love, you'll only end up hurt when Mama steers you towards someone more suitable. What if it's too late? I can't help the way he makes me feel. It's true love, and it's the most wonderful thing I've ever experienced." "I really don't know what you're talking about," Charity snapped. "It's just a childish infatuation." She stood up and paced to the window to disguise the sudden prickling of tears behind her eyes. "George told me that he can't bear to be apart from me," Fiona cried. "He loves me, and we're going to find a way to be together. If Papa finds out, he'll forbid you from ever seeing him again. And I don't blame him. I expect George just sees you as a way to marry into money so he can carry on painting at Papa's expense." Charity wished she could bite the words back as soon as they left her mouth when she saw Fiona's shocked expression. "You're just jealous because Theodore doesn't have a romantic bone in his body," Fiona retorted. 2 spots of color had appeared on her cheeks, and her eyes narrowed with anger. Charity turned away and looked through the window. The manicured garden below blurred as tears welled in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Fiona. That was cruel of me. I wish I could feel just a tiny part of what you've just described." Her shoulders slumped, and she went to sit next to Fiona. "I'm sorry too, Charity. Truly I am. Let's not fall out. Tell me, what does it really feel like?" Charity blurted out her question, pushing down the thought that it seemed terribly unfair that her younger sister seemed to have found love first, whereas she was the one who should have, being the eldest. The 2 sisters hugged, their disagreement blowing over as quickly as it had started. "I honestly never expected to feel this way," Fiona explained, wanting Charity to understand that she wasn't doing this to make trouble. "I saw the way Bessie looked at me, as though I'm still a silly child with no understanding of grown-up emotions. But these feelings just came over me like a thunderbolt." Charity looked at Fiona, seeing the way that her face looked like it was lit from within every time she mentioned George's name. Anyone could see she was speaking the plain truth. Her sister was head over heels in love, and she just hoped that George wouldn't lead her astray and compromise her reputation. "I'm not a fool." Fiona's words were quiet, almost as though she was speaking to herself. She shook her head slightly. "I know that Mama and Papa would forbid it, but I can't help loving him, Charity." She sighed heavily. "Why does it always come down to who's suitable for us? Papa didn't come from a wealthy background, and Mama never gave it a second thought. But now that we're a wealthy family, it seems like all that matters is marrying well, whether we love them or not." Charity nodded, acknowledging the irony that her parents had been poor but very much in love when they had first gotten married. "I know Bessie said marriages like ours are rarely about love, But do you think Theodore will tell me that he loves me? I don't think I could bear a lifetime of being with someone who just married me because it was good for the family business. Charity's voice wobbled slightly as tears threatened again. I'm sure he's just playing mysterious. Fiona brightened, giving her a mischievous smile. Just you wait. When he sees you coming down the stairs tonight in that green satin gown, he won't be able to stop himself from declaring how much he loves you, even in front of Papa. Charity wiped the last of her tears away, feeling better about the evening already. Fiona was right. Even though it felt as though marriage to Theodore was out of obligation to their families, she was sure he must love her deep down. He's just doing the gentlemanly thing and doesn't want to embarrass me. The thought comforted Charity, and she started to feel a fizz of excitement in her chest about the evening. She realized that she had allowed her own unrealistic expectations to cloud her judgment and see Theodore in an unkind light. When the time is right, he will declare how much he loves me, and it will be just like Fiona said, the most amazing feeling in the world. She hugged the thought to herself, giving Theodore the benefit of the doubt. Chapter 3. Charity, are you coming downstairs? Our guests have arrived. Mary Cuthbert's voice carried up the stairs to the landing, where Charity gave her reflection one last glance in the full-length mirror. The figure-hugging emerald green gown Mary had told her to wear showed off her small waist and décolletage, and the matching velvet choker around her neck gave her a sophisticated look that didn't match the churning sensation in her stomach. You'll knock him out, looking like that, Fiona whispered, appearing behind her. You go down the stairs first, and I'll follow in a moment. He won't be able to believe his eyes. I guarantee he'll declare undying love and announce an engagement tonight. She squeezed Charity's hand, and her eyes gleamed with excitement. Charity took a deep breath and strolled casually down the sweeping staircase. The lamps cast a soft light that made her skin look lustrous and showed off the glints of copper in her hair. But all Charity could think about was whether Fiona's prediction would come true, and more importantly, why she felt so confused about how it might make her feel if it did. Theodore was already deep in conversation with her father on business matters. Theodore's parents, Albert and Judy, were admiring a tall vase of hothouse flowers that was displayed on the long sideboard behind them. Ah, here you are, Charity, dear. Mary's voice cut through the conversation, and it had the desired effect as Theodore turned to watch Charity, whose natural beauty shone out. Mary darted a look at him, trying to gauge his response, but his expression was blank, almost disinterested, giving nothing away. As Charity reached the bottom of the stairs, Judy Russell looked her up and down with a critical eye. You're so fortunate to be able to get away with wearing last season's color, Charity, with your dark hair. The latest vogue of pale colors that I saw at my fundraising event would probably make you look quite washed out. She gave Charity a brief smile, not noticing the look of hurt that was quickly blinked away. If you would like to step this way and be seated in the dining room. The butler opened the door and ushered them through before melting into the background. As the fragrant ham and pea soup was served, Charity took the opportunity to glance across the table at Theodore. His brown hair was swept back from his forehead, and he had the aquiline features of aristocracy that went back generations. He took a sip of his soup, and Charity noticed how elegantly manicured his hands were. Clearly, he was a man accustomed to a life of leisurely pursuits and giving orders to others, rather than anything which involved physical work. She let her thoughts drift, wondering what it would be like to be swept into Theodore's arms in a passionate embrace until Fiona nudged her back to the present. It's so important for us business owners to stick together, don't you think, Albert? We're the ones building up this great country of ours. Robert Cuthbert signaled for the butler to pour another glass of claret for Albert. He and Mary had agreed that there would be no expense spared on the meal this evening, and he could see how much the Russell family were enjoying their hospitality. Quite right, Robert. Theodore and I were saying just yesterday that it's time for us to expand our dynasty and protect our wealth, weren't we, son? Albert beamed proudly at Theodore, and Mary gave them both a doting glance. Yes, Papa, Theodore replied with a chuckle. We certainly don't want to let the working classes get ideas above their station. Most of our employees don't appreciate how lucky they are to have steady work, yet still they clamor for better pay. Theo is quite the talk of the social circuit, you know, Judy simpered. It's such a comfort to Albert and me knowing the business is in safe hands when he takes over the reins. Whoever he chooses to marry will be most fortunate, she added, giving Mary a pointed look. I couldn't agree more, Robert said. He glanced at Charity, pleased to see that she was looking her very best this evening. What do you say to your workers when they ask for better pay? Charity blurted out her question without thinking, curious to see what Theodore would say. I remind them that if they're not happy, they're free to look for another job elsewhere, Theodore replied with a wry chuckle. Mama does more than enough with her charitable endeavors to help the needy. I wouldn't expect you to understand, but business is business, and we have to put our profits first. Well, I'm sure you don't need to bother Theodore with questions like that, Charity. Us ladies should leave business matters to the fine minds of the gentlemen around the table. Mary deftly changed the subject, asking Theodore about the last theater show he had been to. Charity let the conversation wash over her as they ate the next 2 courses, trying to imagine what her life would be like with Theodore. He seemed so poised and self-assured, and she was under no illusion that he could probably have his pick of daughters from the wealthiest families in the city. She had noticed him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, and she was sure that tonight would be the night he declared his intentions. Your daughters both look very fine this evening. As if reading Charity's thoughts, Theodore raised a glass to Mary and Robert in a lull in the conversation, and Mary's cheeks flushed pink with pleasure. I think it's time for us to retire to the drawing room, she said, turning to Fiona and Judy. Charity, why don't you show Theodore the library while Robert and Albert enjoy a cigar? I expect you've both got plenty to talk about, she added, and we're just along the hall, so there's no impropriety. That sounds most interesting. Theodore held the door open to follow Charity toward the library. So many books. However, do you find the time to read them? Theodore strolled toward the bookshelves that lined the library walls, giving the books a cursory glance. I'd rather be at the gentlemen's club than sitting at home reading. I love to read about other people's adventures, Charity confessed. Charles Dickens is one of my favorite authors. London life sounds quite fascinating, and Jane Austen writes the most dreamy books about romance. We've known each other for a couple of years, Charity, and I didn't know you liked to read. Theodore stood in front of the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back, looking around at the discreet wealth that was evident in the house, from the rows of gold-embossed titles of the book on the shelves to the gleaming silverware. I thought I mentioned it when we danced at the summer ball? Charity knew she had told him, but recalled he had hurried away at the end of the dance to speak to another acquaintance, leaving her alone at the side of the dance floor. It's of no consequence. My mind is usually filled with business matters. He rocked on his feet, deep in thought. I think you did mention it, but that was the evening I met Harold Brandling and his daughter. Now that's going to be a very profitable relationship for our business. Harold is a railroad investor, and he's given me a few good investment tips since then. What do you like to do when you're not working? Charity glanced at the clock on the mantelshelf. It was getting late, and she could feel a headache coming on. I'm forgetting my manners, Theodore said, following her gaze. He coughed awkwardly before striding across the room and taking Charity's hands in his own. There's something I need to say before we leave. Charity held her breath and gazed up into his brown eyes. This is it. The thought blazed through her mind, and she felt her heartbeat quicken. He's going to tell me how much he loves me. She felt the fizz of excitement in her chest again, already anticipating the sudden explosion of love she was about to experience, just like Fiona had described. Papa and I have already spoken to your father, and we all agree that it would be most beneficial for our 2 families to be joined. So we'll set a date for the wedding. I think about 8 weeks' time would be ideal because I plan to leave for a business trip to Europe the following month. That should fit in with my plans perfectly. Theodore held Charity's hands limply in his own, not quite meeting her eye. "Oh, well, I'd love to," Charity murmured. She tried to ignore the sense of disappointment that washed over her, reminding herself of what Fiona had told her earlier that day, that Theodore might just be shy when it came to declaring his feelings. "I think a trip to Europe together would be the perfect, romantic honeymoon." Charity gazed up at him and fluttered her eyelashes, but was surprised by the sudden shake of his head. "Oh no, I didn't mean we would both go. It's a business trip, which I'm sure you'd find very dull. I should be back before Christmas." He bent awkwardly and brushed a dry kiss on her cheek before stepping away. "I don't mind. I'd like to learn more about what you do so we can spend time together and get to know each other more." "I've always wanted to travel, Theodore. Won't you let me come too?" Charity swallowed the lump in her throat, not wanting to sound as if she was pleading for his attention. This wasn't anything like the romantic proposal she had imagined, and she felt a sudden stab of envy for the passion Fiona spoke with whenever she discussed George. "I'm sorry, Charity, but I have to say no. I'm going with Mr. Brandling, and you would only be a distraction from business matters. Besides, I expect you'll be busy looking after the house while I'm away, although Mama has decided on the decor and furniture for it. Perhaps you could sew some samplers or whatever it is that you do to fill your day." Theodore's tone was tinged with irritation that Charity had questioned his plan. "We'd better go and tell your mother the news. My dear Mama already has the wedding planned, how she'd like it. It will be an opportunity to return a few favors for people who have supported our business this year. I have some ideas of what I would like." "No need to bother yourself." Theodore brushed her reply away, holding the door open for them to return to the others. "Mama has excellent taste, and it's more important that the wedding looks the part for our family's guests. We have a certain image to uphold, you see. I wouldn't expect you to understand. You'll just have to trust that I know what's best." Charity trailed along behind him, too dazed to say any more. Theodore's proposal had been so lackluster and different from what she had expected. She wondered whether she had been wrong about love her whole life. Perhaps Bessie is right, and Fiona is deluded about those feelings she has. She shook her head slightly, trying to clear her racing thoughts. Her parents would be delighted, but Theodore scarcely seemed to like her, let alone show the tiniest spark of love she had hoped to see in his eyes. "Papa? Mama? Mr. and Mrs. Cuthbert, we have an announcement." Theodore called everyone into the drawing room. "Oh, my goodness. Is it what I think?" Mary jumped up and clasped her hands together. "Charity and I are to be married the month after next." Theodore glanced at Charity, beckoning for her to come closer. Robert hurried forward to shake Theodore's hand and slapped him jovially on his back. "Welcome to the family, Theodore. It's just like Albert and I said. A wonderful move for both of our businesses, and I'm sure Charity knows just how fortunate she is to become your wife." A ripple of excited chatter passed between Mary and Fiona as they started to discuss the wedding plans, and the Russells prepared to leave. "Well, I'm glad that's all sorted out," Theodore said, with a relieved sigh. He shrugged his coat on and continued in a businesslike tone. "Mama will let you know all the details, and I'll see you soon. I'm a very busy man, as you know, but if you have any questions, I'm sure Mama can take care of them so everything is just right." Charity nodded, still not knowing what to say. As she watched them leave, she felt a shiver of foreboding. Had she just agreed to a lifetime of duty over love? She pushed the uncomfortable thought away. Her parents had been angling for this proposal for so long. There was nothing she could do but agree and hope that one day Theodore might be the loving husband she had always dreamt of. Chapter 4. Mrs. Russell has sent a suggested menu for the wedding meal. Could you take a look at this, Bessie, and start arranging the items she's marked for us to take care of? Mary Cuthbert looked flustered as she hurried from the kitchen back to her parlor. Since Theodore's proposal the week before, there had been at least 2 letters a day with instructions from Judy about what the Russell family wanted. "Yes, ma'am," Bessie replied. She waited until her mistress was out of earshot before sighing heavily and rolling her eyes. "I swear Mrs. Russell seems to think we're all here just twiddling our thumbs waiting for her next orders." she muttered under her breath. It's not like we've got our own things to be getting on with. Fiona sidled into the kitchen and shot her a sympathetic glance. Mama's nerves are stretched to breaking point with this wedding. I'm sure we'll all be glad when it's over. Mrs. Russell seems to be the most demanding woman ever. She's like a horse with the bit between her teeth. Not one single detail is going to be left to chance, it seems. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. I hope Charity knows what she's letting herself in for, Bessie muttered darkly. She couldn't help but feel protective of the family, and Judy Russell seemed to be overstepping the mark at every turn. A woman has to be the mistress of her own home, but I'm not sure Charity will get the chance with Theodore's mother pulling the strings in that family. It wouldn't be like that if I was getting married, Fiona replied. Wouldn't be like what? Charity appeared in the doorway with a large pile of old shirts in her arms and gave Fiona a questioning look. I'm going through these to see which ones can be mended to take to the poorhouse. She placed them on the table beneath the window, where the light was good, and fetched Bessie's sewing box from the dresser. We were just saying that you don't seem to have much of a say in how your wedding is going to be. I don't like to think of you all alone in your new house straight after you get married, while Theodore is in Europe for goodness knows how long. Bessie put a fragrant cup of coffee next to Charity's elbow, then bustled out to the garden to see what vegetables the gardener had for her. The two sisters sat in companionable silence, Fiona daydreaming about George and Charity, trying not to think about life with Theodore. The clock ticked comfortingly on the mantel, and the warmth of the kitchen embraced the two young women like it had thousands of times before. We won't have many more times like this together, Charity suddenly blurted out. I'll miss being with you. You won't be rid of me that easily. Fiona pulled a face, making Charity giggle. Perhaps I can continue to see George at your new house if Papa stops my art lessons? Charity looked startled. Why would he stop your lessons? Don't you have one this afternoon? Yes, but Mama commented that I seemed a bit excitable after my last lesson, which isn't appropriate for young ladies like us, apparently. She rolled her eyes. I'm afraid she might have realized what George and I feel for each other. Let's cross that bridge when we come to it, Charity advised. She had hoped Fiona's infatuation would fizzle out as she considered the practicalities of loving someone who barely scraped a living as an art tutor. But if anything, Fiona seemed more determined than ever. Fiona drained the last mouthful of her coffee and jumped up. I must finish my sketch ready for when George comes after lunch. He's promised he would ask the gallery if they could display one of my drawings. Her face flushed pink with excitement, and she hurried away. Charity sat back in the chair, letting the shirt she was mending rest in her lap. You're so lucky, Fiona, and you don't even realize it, she muttered to herself. Even now, Theodore hasn't said one word about love, or even that he's looking forward to us being married. Her eyes filled with tears, and she wiped them away with her handkerchief. Would you like to eat lunch in the kitchen with me? Bessie bustled in with a basket of fresh salad leaves from the gardener. She gave Charity a sympathetic smile, not wanting to let on that she had overheard her words just now from the doorway. Oh yes, please, Bessie. Mama is out, and Fiona is busy with her latest drawing. To be honest, I'd be grateful for the company to take my mind off things. Charity lifted her chin and busied herself with threading her needle to add a new button to the shirt. She was determined to make the best of her situation, even though her heart felt heavy with dread at the thought of being trapped in a loveless marriage. The clock in the hallway struck 5 as Charity finished the last of the shirts. She stood up and stretched her arms, rubbing at the knot of tension which she could feel on the back of her neck. Her mind had been whirling all afternoon, darting from one idea to the next on how she might be able to delay the wedding. But no matter what she thought of, she knew that her situation was hopeless. Her parents wanted the wedding to go ahead, and the one time Charity had aired her doubts, Mary had brushed them aside instantly, declaring that Charity would set tongues wagging if she continued being so reticent about the engagement. I've never known such ingratitude. Charity, Mary had snapped, pressing a lavender-infused handkerchief to her forehead. Theodore is a fine catch, and you should be grateful instead of moping around hoping for romance. The sound of running feet snapped Charity out of her memories, and Fiona burst into the kitchen. "You'll never guess what," she cried. "Mercy, Fiona, you made me jump." Bessie fanned herself with a tea towel and then started to smile as she saw the excitement on Fiona's face. "Let me guess. George has told you that your picture is going to be displayed in the gallery?" "It's better than that, Bessie. Charity, you're not going to believe this." She hopped from one foot to the other before throwing herself into the chair that Charity had just vacated. "Well, don't keep us in suspense. George just asked me to be his wife, and he told me that he's been keeping a secret from me all this time." "I knew it," Charity muttered. Her face clouded as she braced herself for bad news. "It's not what you think," Fiona reassured her with a giggle. "It turns out that he's not a penniless artist after all. His papa is a very wealthy businessman, but he wanted to see if George was serious about being an artist. He said George had to prove himself on his own merit, and George told me today that he has been getting commissions from wealthy patrons all this time. But why keep it a secret? That doesn't make sense." Bessie shook her head in bewilderment. "George wanted to be sure that I loved him for who he is, not because he comes from a wealthy family." Fiona clasped her hands together, and her face took on a dreamy expression. "And oh, I do love him, I truly do. It's just so romantic. I've been beside myself with worry, thinking I would have to run away to be with him if Papa found out and forbade him from seeing me. So, you're engaged to be married?" Charity pulled Fiona to her feet and threw her arms around her. "I'm so happy for you. That's the best thing I've heard this week." Fiona squealed with excitement and swung Charity around. "George was so naughty. He already spoke to Papa this morning to ask to marry me, and Papa and Mama are both delighted." Bessie looked at Charity and Fiona, brushing away her sudden tears of happiness. Both her girls would be flying the nest, and life would be very different in the blink of an eye. As she watched the girls hugging again, she suddenly saw the sadness etched on Charity's face, even though she had turned her head away so as not to spoil Fiona's moment. "I have to do something to help Charity before she makes a terrible mistake." The thought took shape in Bessie's mind as she clattered around the kitchen, getting the evening meal ready. A sudden idea came to her, and she tied her shawl around her shoulders, telling the sisters that she had to pop out for half an hour. "Could you pack my sewing basket away, please, Charity? I'd do it myself, but your mama has asked me to bake a cake to celebrate Fiona's good news." Fiona had scampered off to talk about dresses with Mary for the last couple of hours, leaving Charity in the kitchen, packing away the shirts ready for her visit to the poorhouse the following morning. Bessie knew that if she didn't act now, she would lose her nerve. Charity nodded quietly and slid the sewing box back onto its shelf. "There's something on the shelf that you might like to read," Bessie added as she busied herself whisking sugar and butter in a bowl. Charity saw the paper, which hadn't been there earlier, and pulled it down. "This is the Matrimonial Times, Bessie. Why would I want this?" Her brow furrowed with confusion. "I overheard what you said earlier when you were in here by yourself." Bessie's face was a mixture of concern and guilt. "I wasn't eavesdropping, Charity, but I can see you're not happy. All I'm saying is have a look at the advertisements. I know ladies who have found true love out west. I'm not saying you should break off your engagement. Lord knows, your mama would be furious. But don't make a mistake you can't get out of just to keep other people happy is all." Charity folded the paper up and slipped it into her pocket. "I suppose it might entertain me if nothing else. We both know I have to marry Theodore, Bessie. I appreciate your concern, though." She patted the housekeeper's arm, wondering why it was that Bessie could see what her own mother refused to acknowledge. Theodore didn't love her one little bit, and probably never would. Chapter 5. Montana. Frederick Hopkins shielded his eyes from the sun as he reined his horse to a halt at the entrance to Buck Ranch. In the distance, he could see the dust rising from someone approaching. "Let's not get our hopes up, boy. It probably won't come to anything." His horse flicked one ear backward at the sound of Fred's voice, and he swished his tail to get rid of the fly that was annoying him. Frederick jumped down and looped the reins over a fence post. He walked along the line of the fence, checking that the repairs he had made from when his cattle had broken out were still holding strong. "Got a letter for you, Fred." Fred lifted his hat to thank Luke, their neighbor, who had dropped the letter at the gateway before galloping onward to the next ranch. "Huh, guess I was too hasty, Blaze." He retrieved the letter and ripped it open, and the horse turned to watch him curiously. "Dear Mr. Hopkins, my name is Charity Cuthbert, and I'm writing in response to your advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. The way you describe your life out west sounds like exactly the kind of adventure I would like to have, although I'm sure you will have plenty of other young ladies replying to your advertisement to choose from. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I particularly enjoy looking after the children at the poorhouse, where I help out several days each week. The way you write about your ranch is very moving. I can tell you have a real love for the land and your stock. I would like to have a family of my own, just like you. My deepest wish is to work alongside a man, as husband and wife, rather than being treated like some sort of social butterfly with no use other than looking pretty. I hope you don't think I've spoken out of turn, but I value honesty, especially between two people who are building a life together. Yours, in hope, Charity Cuthbert." Fred sighed deeply and shook his head before swinging himself up into the saddle again. "I'm not sure where this might lead to, Blaze, but the way I see it, I ain't got much choice." He squeezed his legs, and the horse set off for the cabin in the distance at a steady lope. In spite of his misgivings, this was the first time in several months that Fred noticed the way the sun sparkled on the river that wound through the pasture. The color of the wildflowers in the grass seemed brighter, and the bird song above him sounded louder. It was as if a dark cloud had cleared, and he had started to feel like his old self again. As the wooden ranch house came into view, his mouth curved into a smile. Alicia, his housekeeper, had hung the washing out, and it flapped lazily in the breeze. "I've made lunch for you, if you want some before you go out again," she called. The sight of the ranch house never failed to lift his spirits, even in the darkest of times. His pa had built it from nothing as a young man after traveling west with his ma. Every log of the homestead and every stone of the wall around the garden had been put there by his parents when they had settled in the small valley all those years ago. Over the following years, they had gradually built their cattle numbers up, and now Fred had a herd that was the envy of many of the ranch owners around Blossom Creek. "Just one thing missing, though," he muttered to himself. He had tried to ignore his feelings of loneliness, but as one day blurred into the next, and he saw the birds and animals pairing up during spring, he had realized that it wasn't right to be alone. "Your pa would have wanted you to have a woman's touch around the place," Alicia had said to him one evening, seeing him brooding on the porch as the sun sank in the west. "He and Ma ain't here to see, though, are they?" he had shot back. He knew that Alicia was right, and her comment had rattled around in his mind as he worked over the following days. Eventually, he had conceded and reluctantly penned an advertisement, telling her to submit it to the paper the next time she went to town for supplies. He had never imagined that he would actually receive a reply from anyone. "Well, did we get any post?" Alicia's wizened face crinkled into a toothless grin when she saw his expression as she put a bowl of stew on the table for him. "I saw 2 chickadees singing together by the washing line earlier and took it as a sign that you'd get a letter back today." Fred gave a wry chuckle. "You might be getting old, Alicia, but nothing gets past you, does it?" "Yes, I got a letter back, but I probably won't reply. What good could possibly come of it?" Alicia rested her hand briefly on his shoulder. "Sometimes life has a way of working out that we can't always see in the present. If a young lady took the time to write you, the least you can do is reply to her. Tell her about Buck Ranch and the sunsets, or how folks in Blossom Creek are the friendliest in the district. Maybe she'd like to know about—" All right, I'll write back. Just don't expect too much, Alicia. I'm not sure who would want to take on someone in my situation." Fred's words died on his lips, and a shadow of sadness crossed his face. "I know," Alicia said softly. She patted his shoulder again and put a glass of water on the table before turning back to the stove to make coffee. "Sometimes what's happened in the past has to stay there, and you gotta take a leap of faith to have a better future," she quietly murmured, glancing at the man she'd worked for all her life, as well as his parents before him. They had been through tough times, but it was her dearest wish that Fred would open his heart to love. The next few weeks passed in a blur. It was a busy time on the ranch as the grass grew lush in the paddocks, and Frederick worked from dawn until dusk on all the jobs he hadn't been able to get to during the winter. In the distance, the snow had finally melted from the tops of the mountains, and the wildflowers were starting to blossom like tiny jewels in the meadows. "Howdy, neighbor. Let me know if you want me to take another letter into town." Luke reined his horse to a halt and called over their shared boundary fence, grinning at Frederick. "A little birdie tells me things might be looking up for you." Dorothy and Alicia got chatting after Sunday school, and Alicia let it slip. Frederick rolled his eyes and gave a good-natured shrug. "I don't expect anything will come of it, so let's not count our chickens, right? This place keeps me busy enough, and it takes a special kind of woman who would want a life like this." His face saddened for a moment as he pushed his hat back, wiping the sweat from his brow. Luke nodded his understanding. At this time of year, when the cattle were fat and the weather was good, it could look like paradise to the casual observer. But in the hard winters, and when crops failed, it was a different story. One of hardship and struggling to make ends meet that could test even the strongest marriage. "Dorothy said for me to tell you not to give up hope." He tipped his hat before galloping off. Frederick picked up the sledgehammer and continued driving the fence posts into the dusty ground, enjoying the ache in his muscles from a hard day's work. The last few letters he had received from Charity had felt like a breath of fresh air, and he suddenly realized how much he had come to look forward to them. "Maybe Alicia is right, Blaze. I guess this is the best time of year to introduce someone to Buck Ranch, boy, isn't it?" He let the thought roll around in his head, not wanting to be too hasty and do something he might regret. An hour later, the sky lit up with streaks of gold and pink as the sun started to sink in the west. Frederick packed up his tools and jumped onto Blaze's back, letting the reins hang loose as the horse loped back toward the barn, knowing where they were going without needing to be told. Frederick let his mind empty from all the worries of running the ranch and breathed in the warm evening air, enjoying the scent of dust and flowers that was unique to the early summer days. He had come to a decision. Buck Ranch needed a woman, and he hoped that Charity would fit the bill. As Blaze followed the track along the edge of the river, Frederick felt his eyes magnetically pulled toward the swirling water that looked deceptively calm at this time of year. "Am I doing the right thing? It won't be the same, but maybe it's the only way. Lord, give me a sign." His whispered words went unanswered as the breeze rustled the grass around them. With his mind spinning with conflicting emotions, Fred didn't notice the feather that drifted down onto the surface of the river and floated away. All he knew was that if he didn't go ahead with his plans straight away, his resolve would fail. Chapter 6. New York, June 1880. Charity's hands trembled as she read the letter a second time. The words danced in front of her eyes, and her breath caught in her throat as she whispered the words to herself, scarcely able to believe them. "Dear Charity, over these last few weeks, your letters have touched me, and I have found myself thinking of love, much to my surprise. You sound like the sort of woman a man could be proud to have by his side and call his wife. I'm not good at fancy words. I'm born and bred in the country, and we have a plain way of speaking that city folks might think is too ordinary. But as I'm sitting here on my porch, watching the sun go down over the ranch, I know that if I don't ask today, I might lose you to someone else and regret it. Would you marry me, Charity? I believe I can offer you a good life here at Buck Ranch. There might be challenging times, and it's nothing like what you're used to in the city, but you seem like a person who would relish a new life somewhere different from what you know. I'm enclosing the money for your journey out here and to cover your other travel costs. I will meet you off the train at Blossom Creek Station on the agreed date, and we can fix a time for the wedding when you arrive. Yours in anticipation, Frederick. What shall I do? It was only meant to be a harmless distraction. Charity's words came out in a hoarse whisper, echoing back to her as she looked guiltily at her reflection in her bedroom mirror. Who are you talking to? Fiona breezed into the room with a gown draped over her arm. I swear the stress of your wedding is getting to you if you're talking to yourself. She chuckled and held the gown up on its hanger for Charity to see. Do you think this would do for my going away outfit? Yes. I'm sure it would be fine. You haven't even looked at it. Fiona laid the gown on Charity's bed with a sigh and peered at her sister more closely. Are you feeling ill? You don't look right at all. Don't tell me you've caught something from volunteering at the poorhouse? She stepped backward and covered her mouth with her handkerchief. We don't want to get sick right before our weddings. The words were muffled, and Fiona reached for some lavender water to waft into the air between them. I'm not ill, quite the opposite. I think I feel better than I have for weeks. Charity jumped up and started pacing around the room. Her cheeks had flushed pink, and she suddenly stopped in front of Fiona, grabbing her into a hug. Something quite incredible has happened. I'm going to be married to someone who loves me. You see, I told you Theodore would tell you that he loves you in his own sweet time, although I am a little cross that he made you wait so long. Fiona returned Charity's hug enthusiastically, glad to see her sister looking happy again. It's not Theodore. It's Frederick Hopkins, and he's just proposed to me. Charity snatched up the letter and waved it in Fiona's face. But I thought you told me you weren't going to reply to any of the advertisements. When Bessie told me you were looking, we had that conversation. I clearly remember. Fiona put her hands on her hips, looking perplexed. I never intended to, but I was so fed up with Theodore and his mother treating the wedding as though I wasn't even a part of it. Charity shrugged and sat down again, suddenly looking crestfallen. I replied to Frederick's advertisement out of curiosity. I assumed that he would choose someone else, but then he wrote back to me, and he sounded lonely, so I replied. I never for one moment imagined that he would ask me to marry him. Every time I sent a letter, I thought it would be the last one. Her words trailed off, and Fiona could see the conflicting emotions of guilt and hope chasing across her face. But what on earth will Mama and Papa say? You can't be promised to two people at the same time, Charity. You'll have to return the money and tell Frederick it was a mistake. It's all very well for you to say that. George loves you dearly. It's plain to see. But Theodore never even speaks to me or looks at me with an ounce of love, the way I see it when George is with you. Tears welled in Charity's eyes, and she dashed them away in frustration. Please don't do anything hasty, Fiona cried. You could throw everything away just to discover it's a mirage. You say Frederick loves you, but how can you really know from a few letters? Her words hung between them until Charity eventually nodded. I know you're only trying to protect me, Fiona. But when I read Frederick's letters, it's the only time I get an inkling of the feelings you've described. It's not a thunderbolt of love, but it's better than the cold indifference that Theodore shows me. It seems as long as Judy Russell gets what she wants for their family, my own wishes don't matter a jot. I think we should talk to Bessie about this, Fiona said decisively. We can't tell Mama, and it was Bessie who put this crazy idea in your head. She needs to take some responsibility for what's happened. She tossed her curls and picked the gown up again. Come downstairs in a little while when you've had a chance to think about everything. I'm going to tell Bessie right now. With that, she hurried back downstairs, her head spinning with the drama that her family was about to be plunged into unless Charity came to her senses. If that grocery boy doesn't remember my order properly next week, I'll take my business elsewhere. This is the third time I've had to go to the store to buy the things he's forgotten in as many weeks. Bessie unpacked the contents of her basket on the large scrubbed table, muttering to herself. Fiona hurried from the parlor where she had been to double-check that Mary was definitely out at the weekly luncheon she attended every Monday and called up for Charity to come to the kitchen. The last thing she wanted was for their mother to find out about Charity's dilemma before they'd had a chance to ask Bessie for her advice. "We need to tell you about something, Bessie." Fiona sat up straighter in the chair at the head of the table, crossing her arms. In the time since she had learned of Charity's news, she had decided the only option was for her and Bessie to persuade Charity to forget this had ever happened and hope that Theodore never found out. "This looks mighty serious," Bessie said with a chuckle, looking between Charity and Fiona. She poured them some coffee and waited for what Fiona had to say. "A man from out west has proposed to Charity." Fiona blurted it out with no preamble, knowing there was no time to spare. "And it's by a letter, for goodness sake. She's meant to be marrying Theodore at the end of the week. It's all a terrible mess. I dread to think what Mama would say if she knew." "It's not Bessie's fault, so don't you go telling tales," Charity interjected hastily when she saw the shock on Bessie's face. "I know what you're going to tell me to do, and I promise I'll write straight back to Frederick and say I can't come, and he mustn't contact me again. I never meant for it to get this far." Her face clouded with disappointment at the thought of never hearing from Frederick again, but she knew it was the right thing to do. They both turned to look at Bessie, waiting for her to agree. "Ah, I didn't think it would come to anything either, Miss Charity." Bessie shuffled in her chair, looking down at her lap for a moment to gather her thoughts. "I won't let Mama and Papa down if that's what you're worried about." Bessie held up her hand to interrupt Charity. "Normally, I would agree with you, but the thing is, I bumped into Mrs. Dowding again at the store this morning. You don't know her. She's the housekeeper for Mr. and Mrs. Brandling, and we see each other quite regularly. Mr. Brandling is that railroad investor Theodore is going to Europe with on his business trip." Charity gave Bessie a puzzled look, wondering why she was telling them about this. "I've grappled with my conscience on whether I should say anything." Bessie paused to take a sip of her coffee before continuing. "There might be nothing in it, and you know I don't hold with spreading gossip, but Mrs. Dowding is a God-fearing woman who I trust wouldn't tell lies." "What exactly are you trying to say, Bessie?" Fiona demanded impatiently. "It seems that Theodore has been paying regular visits to the Brandlings' eldest daughter, Phoebe, over recent months. In fact, Mrs. Dowding overheard Phoebe telling her friends that Theodore has mentioned marriage to her and is convinced that he'll be announcing their engagement any day." The blood drained from Charity's face as Bessie's words sank in. "But he said they were just business acquaintances." "The Dowdings are an extremely wealthy family," Bessie added. "I can only think that Theodore is hedging his bets and doesn't have the morals to do the right thing. I was so shocked when Mrs. Dowden told me. I begged her not to tell anyone else." She fanned herself, feeling flustered at the memory of finding out what Theodore was really like. "How dare he treat you like that, Charity? He's making a fool of you, and if people find out about this, your reputation will be in tatters." Fiona rushed to her sister's side to give her a hug. "No wonder he didn't tell you that he loved you. He's a charlatan, stringing you along like this. Wait until I see him." Charity shook her head to clear her thoughts before giving Fiona and Bessie a tremulous smile. "You were right to tell me, Bessie. And you know what? You've just saved me from making a terrible mistake. Theodore never loved me, but I can tell from Frederick's letters that he's not like that at all. He doesn't care about marrying into wealth or for business. He likes me for who I am." Bessie patted her hand. "But what about your mama? This will come as a terrible shock to her." Charity jumped up, feeling galvanized by the revelation. "My mind's made up," she declared. "I'm leaving on the next train to Blossom Creek, and Mama can't stop me. Order a carriage for me, Bessie. There's no time to waste. Theodore can marry Phoebe for all I care, because I won't be here to see it." She grabbed Fiona's hands and swung her around the kitchen with excitement. "I'll be married to a fine, upstanding man out west called Frederick Hopkins, living a brand new life," she added, giggling through her sudden tears of happiness that she had been freed from her obligations to Theodore. Bessie shook her head in astonishment as Charity and Fiona dashed up the stairs to pack some bags and make plans. Charity looked as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, and although she would miss her, She felt proud that the young woman was taking matters into her own hands instead of always doing what other people expected of her. Chapter 7. Montana. As the train rumbled toward Blossom Creek, Charity rubbed the sleep from her eyes and gazed out at the vast expanse of land they were traveling through. The meadow grass was dotted with flowers, and it rippled in the breeze like waves being ruffled on the ocean's edge. In the distance, she could see the hazy purple outline of the mountains that Frederick had described in his letters. She smoothed her dress down, wondering whether she had brought enough gowns with her for life at the ranch. The woman opposite her, who had shyly introduced herself as Rebecca, had been polite but quiet for most of the journey, which had suited Charity just fine. Charity was so excited that she had talked almost non-stop for the first day, declaring that they would be the best of friends because, by coincidence, Rebecca was also traveling to Blossom Creek to be a bride. But now that they had almost arrived, she felt the first wave of nerves as she realized that she had no idea what Frederick even looked like, apart from his scant description in his letters of being tall with blonde hair. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to imagine a ruggedly good-looking man sweeping her off her feet at the station. A smile played on her mouth, and she vowed that she would write to Fiona at the earliest opportunity to tell her all about her amazing new life. Blossom Creek. 5 minutes until we reach Blossom Creek. The conductor hurried down the carriage, and there was a hum of chatter as people gathered up their belongings. Charity leaned forward and shook Rebecca awake. "We're here, Rebecca, and look how pretty it is. I declare I've never seen such sweet-looking houses and so much space. I can hardly believe my eyes. Frederick told me in his letters that the sunsets at Buck Ranch are more beautiful than anything I would have ever seen." Her new friend sat up straighter to look out of the window. Charity was surprised that Rebecca didn't look more excited at the thought of meeting her new husband in the next few minutes, when her own heart felt like it was trying to jump out of her chest. "Thank you for your company on the journey, Charity. It would be nice if we could stay in touch, don't you think, seeing as we're both in the same town?" Rebecca's face was etched with sudden worry, and Charity leaned forward to give her a hug. "Of course," she replied. "I just know we're both going to be so happy here, but I sure would like to see a friendly face when I go into town. Send me a letter at Buck Ranch to tell me where you're staying, and we can meet up when I come into town for provisions. Frederick told me I might find it strange living out in the middle of nowhere after New York, so I'm sure he won't mind me coming to meet you." The two women exchanged smiles as the train slowly came to a halt, recognizing that there was no going back now. Their new lives were about to begin. A moment later, Charity alighted from the train carriage, feeling herself being pulled along in the jostle of the crowd. She hitched her carpetbag higher in the crook of her arm and squared her shoulders in readiness for what was to come. Steam billowed from the train's engine, and a gaggle of children darted past her to reach their pa, shrieking with excitement. "I'll take your trunk out to the wagons, ma'am," the porter called over his shoulder to her as he hurried past. Wheeling a teetering pile of trunks and boxes toward the wagons which were lined up in the square beyond the station's office. "Oh, thank you kindly. I'm here to meet Frederick Hopkins. Do you know which wagon is his?" "Fred, huh? We all know one another in these parts, ma'am. It ain't nothing like the city," the porter chuckled, weaving deftly between everyone. It was surprisingly busy for a small country town, and Charity was pleased that there seemed to be a bustling community for her to be part of. "And do you know who Frederick is? I haven't met him before, you see. One of those mail-order brides, are you?" The porter slowed down for her to catch up, looking at her with renewed interest. "I'm surprised Fred's looking so soon." He bit back his words and gave her an encouraging smile. "Sorry, ma'am." "None of my business. That's him at the end of the station." He jerked his head toward the man standing slightly apart from everyone before steering his handcart away. "Welcome to Blossom Creek, by the way," he added, giving her a grin. Charity swallowed, her mouth suddenly feeling dry. What if I don't like him? Or worse, what if he doesn't like me, Before she had time to process her thoughts, she noticed that the man the porter had pointed out was strolling toward her. He tilted the wide-brimmed hat back slightly on his head and looked at her with an expression that was hard to read. "Are you Charity Cuthbert, ma'am?" His voice was like warm honey, and its deep tone sent a shiver down Charity's back, even though the day was hot. The sun was behind him, and as he came closer, Charity had to tip her head to look up at him. Yes, that's me." The carefully prepared words of introduction she had planned on the train vanished from her head, and she felt her heart skip a beat. Even though he had the rugged looks of a man who worked hard outside, she hadn't expected him to be the most handsome man she had ever met. "I'm Frederick Hopkins, pleased to make your acquaintance." His generous mouth curved into a hesitant smile, and he took his hat off, revealing tousled, straw-colored hair that lifted in the breeze. It's nice to meet you too, Mr. Hopkins." The words came out as a stutter, and Charity felt the heat of a blush washing her cheeks as she looked up into his flecked green eyes that held her in their steady gaze. "Folks who know me call me Fred," he continued. "Let me take your bag. I see Jed has already taken care of your trunk." He lifted the bag from her arm as though it was as light as a feather, and his hand brushed hers, sending sudden tingles up her arm. "Is it a long way to your ranch, Fred?" Charity followed him toward the wagon. She glanced down the street, taking in the row of signs. A saloon, a bank, several boarding houses, a mercantile store, and more establishments further away that she couldn't make out. "Shouldn't take more than a little while for us to get there," he replied casually, placing her carpetbag securely behind the wagon seat. He helped her up, making sure she was settled comfortably before patting the horse's neck gently and slipping onto the seat next to her. "Good to see you in town again, Fred," a young woman called as she hurried past. She shot Charity an openly curious look and seemed about to ask who she was, but Fred didn't give her the chance. "You too, Lily. Hope those boys of yours are helping out plenty, what with you and Meyer expecting a third." He tickled the reins on the horse's back, and the wagon rolled forward along the dusty thoroughfare. "You'll soon find out that everyone knows everyone's business here in Blossom Creek," he chuckled, turning to grin at Charity. Charity stole a glance at Fred as he concentrated on navigating the wagon around a row of schoolchildren who were walking in line, chattering loudly as their teacher tried to steer them toward the park. His chiseled jaw was stubbled with several days' growth, and there was a fan of lines that crinkled at the edge of his eyes when he smiled. He sensed her gaze and turned to look at her once they had safely passed the children. "I hope your journey went well. I expect you're tired after all that traveling." He smiled at her before turning back to keep an eye on the thoroughfare. "It was longer than I thought it would be," Charity replied with a nod. "But as luck would have it, I befriended another woman who was also coming out here to be married, so that helped the time pass quicker." She blushed as soon as the words left her mouth, realizing that she had been the first to mention the fact that they would soon be man and wife. She hoped he wouldn't think she was being forward, but on reflection, the whole situation was so far removed from anything she had experienced before in her whole life that her slip of the tongue hardly seemed to matter. There are a few ladies who wind up out west to marry." Fred cleared his throat, making Charity wonder if he was as nervous as she was. "I spoke to the pastor, and he's agreed for us to get wed before we head back to Buck Ranch." He turned his head to glance back at the large clock at the edge of the park they had just passed. "If we go there now, he's expecting us. That's okay with you, is it?" Charity felt her mouth gape open with surprise before she could gather her composure. Get married today? Right now? Even though that was why she had come here, she suddenly wished that Fiona was here to keep her company. Everything seemed to be happening so fast. Fred shot her an apologetic look. "Well, Alicia, my cook is at the ranch, but I figured it would be more proper to get wed right away. But, I don't want to offend." "Oh no, you haven't. I mean, yes, a wedding today. That would be wonderful." She looked into Fred's kindly face and nodded, feeling her heart skip a beat again as he urged the horse into a trot. As they rumbled toward the edge of town, she could see a small church in the distance. She took a deep breath, stealing another glance at his rugged profile and the strong, capable hands that rested on the reins. All around them, the birds were singing, and a shaft of sunlight lit up the hills in front of them as a cloud moved across the sun. Charity had never seen such a beautiful place in her life, and she felt her heart lift with excitement, finally starting to understand the feelings that Fiona had described to her. It seemed like she was falling in love with Fred, even though they had only just met. Chapter 8. Fred kept his gaze forward as the wagon bowled along the dusty main street toward the church on the edge of town. He could sense Charity peeking at him out of the corner of his eye, assessing him, and he let his mind drift back over the last few weeks. Alicia had been delighted that he had finally plucked up the courage to propose to Charity, even if it was via a letter that had felt more like a business arrangement than a way to spend the rest of your life with someone. Maybe it is more of a business arrangement, though. After all, is it really possible to love a person you've never even met? The thought had niggled away, filling him with doubts, until Alicia had noticed and told him in no uncertain terms that it was time to put the past behind him. He had nodded his agreement, but he knew that deep in his heart he was filled with fear that he would only ever be lucky enough to have truly loved someone once in his lifetime. And that woman had already been and gone. He stole another glance at Charity, under the pretext of turning to check the fence posts were properly secured in the back of the wagon. The sunshine had already brought a healthy glow to her cheeks, and her chestnut hair curled attractively around her heart-shaped face. He knew that it would only be a matter of weeks until she had a dusting of freckles across her nose once she spent more time outside at the ranch. Her brown eyes were framed with long lashes, and her mouth was the color of crushed berries. As he caught her eye, he felt an unusual emotion grip him. Was it the stirrings of attraction? It had been so long since he felt that way that he felt his mind close to the idea of it immediately. "Here we are, then," he said, pulling the horse to a halt outside the front of the church. "I don't come to church as often as I should, on account of being busy on the ranch and how long it takes to get here, but the pastor understands that's what life is like for most ranchers. Maybe it's something we can enjoy together when you're not too busy, I mean." Charity smoothed her curls, not noticing a stray lock of hair that had come loose from her tortoiseshell comb. "Let me get that for you," Fred said, instinctively reaching forward to brush it from her cheek. He noticed the warm humor in her dark eyes and hastily jumped down from the wagon to cover the confusion of feelings which suddenly overwhelmed him. Guilt, sadness. He was reminded so sharply of the day he had married his first wife, Lauren, all those years ago, that it took his breath away. But what he hadn't expected to feel was the glimmer of new feelings for a woman he had only just laid eyes on. "I'm sorry it's happening so fast, but I didn't want you to feel uncomfortable being at the ranch without us being married." He took Charity's hand to help her down from the wagon and tucked it into the crook of his arm, taking a deep breath. Charity's smile lit up her face, sending fresh pangs of guilt through him. "You're a very thoughtful man, Fred, and I appreciate that. It looks like the pastor is waiting for us," she added with a nervous smile as they both saw him throwing open the door of the church and beckoning them in. The next few minutes passed in a blur. Fred tried to focus only on Charity, but his memories caught him off guard. Memories of a church filled with friends and the way his heart had soared when he had seen the shaft of sunlight fall on Lauren's fair head and the simple meadow flowers she held in her hands. By comparison, this time, it was just the two of them and the pastor, who seemed to be in a hurry to get the service over as quickly as possible, making it feel rushed and impersonal. Fred felt another pang of guilt, knowing that Charity deserved better. "I pronounce you man and wife." The pastor beamed at them both and snapped his Bible shut, wrenching Fred from his memories. "Thank you, Pastor Wallace, and I promise we'll do our best to come more often than I have been." It seemed like only a matter of minutes before they were back in the wagon again, heading westwards, leaving the buildings and bustle of Blossom Creek behind. Fred was pleased that Alicia had had the foresight to suggest a celebratory meal for when they got back to the ranch. "It'll be hard enough for her, taking all this on after living in the city," Alicia had said a couple of days earlier, sweeping her arm to take the house and land beyond in her gesture. "The least we can do is welcome her with a nice meal, don't you think? And make the spare room up for her with fresh linen sheets as well," Fred had said gruffly. "Won't she be in your—" Fred had held up his hand to cut Alicia's words off. "I haven't told her everything. Some things are best explained in person. So, I reckon she should have her own room in case she finds it all too much to take in, at least to start with." Alicia had shaken her head, making it clear that she didn't agree. "I'm checking the cattle on the far boundary. You can leave my food on the stove. I'll be back late." Fred had hurried away, not wanting to see the disappointment in Alicia's eyes. Even though he tried to tell himself that getting the spare room made up for Charity was out of thoughtfulness for her, he knew he was kidding himself. He was scared that when Charity found out the truth, she would want nothing to do with Buck Ranch, and this was his way of saving his pride. "This countryside is so beautiful." Charity's excited tones snapped him back to the present, and he followed her gaze, seeing it through fresh eyes. "Where I used to live, it was so built up, all the tenement houses crammed together in the poorer areas. It was no wonder there was so much illness around. I was one of the fortunate ones, but I used to long to see wide-open spaces like this." Her enthusiasm was catching, and Fred felt a swell of admiration for her. Not many people would be brave enough to travel across the country to start a new life, but he was quickly realizing that Charity was not like most people. There was a plucky resilience beneath her beauty that wouldn't stand for any nonsense. "Are you warm enough? It can get chilly in the wagon once the sun starts to get low in the sky." Fred reached under the seat and pulled out a soft woolen blanket that he wrapped over her knees. "That'll keep you warm, and Alicia will have the fire lit when we get home. She's so excited to meet you. She's been the family's cook and housekeeper since before I was born. Reckon she thinks of me like a son since my own parents died." "I can't wait to meet her," Charity replied, smiling her thanks for the blanket. Fred felt the unfamiliar feeling in his chest again as Charity leaned slightly against him on the wagon seat, steadying herself as they hit a rough patch. It had only been just shy of a year since Lauren's passing, and the last thing he wanted was to replace her. But there was something about Charity that made the numbness that had gripped him since he had been widowed feel as though it was starting to recede. It was almost as though Charity Cuthbert had come into his life to remind him to open his heart to love again, whether he was ready or not. Chapter 9. Welcome to Buck Ranch. Fred slowed their wagon, wanting Charity to see the view that never failed to lift his spirits. A wooden sign hung over the entrance, and the long, dusty track ahead wound through the pasture, climbing gently upwards to the home he had lived in since the day he was born. "Oh, Fred, it's beautiful." Charity's eyes were filled with wonder as she took in the scene. Birds drifted high on the thermals above them, and cattle studded the paddocks, heads down, grazing on the lush grass. She could see a river tumbling down from a crevice in the closest mountain, gradually becoming wider and more gentle as it reached the flatter land around them, looping back on itself to create a gravelly beach where some of the cattle stood knee-deep to have a drink. "I couldn't imagine ever living anywhere else," Fred agreed, and Charity could hear the quiet pride in his voice. He clicked his tongue, and the horse set off again, trotting briskly toward the homestead. The main ranch house was a mellow amber color as the rays of the setting sun glanced off the roughly hewn logs it was built from, and there was a generous porch that ran the length of the home. To the side, there were 2 barns of different sizes, and Charity could see chickens pecking at the ground beneath an orchard of apple trees, as well as several horses that trotted along the fence, whinnying as soon as they saw the wagon. "This is everything I ever dreamed of," Charity murmured, more to herself than to Fred. "I've got to warn you, it's not quite as lovely as this in the middle of winter," Fred chuckled, "but the summers more than make up for it." Charity sat up straighter, not wanting to miss a moment. She was already imagining how she would describe the rolling green hills to Fiona in her first letter home. And the way the sides of the mountain range behind that stretched away as far as the eye could see looked like molten gold in the sunset. Ma always used to say this place was like a little slice of heaven right here on earth, Fred said, watching Charity's expression as she drank it all in. I think your ma sounds like a very wise woman, Charity replied. I'll let you settle in, and then there are a couple of things I need to explain about my situation. Fred guided the wagon to the front of the barn, avoiding Charity's quizzical look, and hurried round to help her down, hitching her carpet bag over his arm. That sounds intriguing. Nothing I should be worried about, I hope? No sooner had the words left her mouth than the front door of the ranch burst open, and two young children tumbled down the steps, skidding to a halt in front of them. Pa, Alicia said we had to wait until after you brought Charity into the house to introduce ourselves, but we were too excited. A tussle-headed boy who was the spitting image of Fred gazed up at Charity, a grin hovering on his mouth. And me too. I put my best Sunday frock on Pa. Did I do the right thing? A younger girl, aged about 6, stepped out from behind the boy, who looked to be a year older, and shyly glanced up at Charity through her lashes before sidling up to Fred and thrusting her hand into his. Children, I told you to wait. Come back inside until your pa's good and ready. The sound of a woman's voice hollering from inside the ranch house was quickly followed by hasty footsteps, and an elderly woman appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Oh, goodness me, I'm sorry, ma'am. That didn't go how it was meant to. The woman patted her hair self-consciously and shot Fred an apologetic look. She hurried down the steps, pulling the boy to her side, and gave Charity a little curtsy. Pa? What do you mean, Pa? Charity said faintly, looking at the children with confusion written all over her face. She wondered if she had misheard. Didn't you tell her yet, Pa? The boy rolled his eyes and grinned up at Charity again. He promised he was going to tell you in the wagon on the way here, but I guess he forgot. Charity turned to Fred and folded her arms to quell the lurching sensation in her stomach. The situation felt as clear as mud, but she knew that something was very wrong. Yes, I guess you forgot, Fred. When exactly did you plan on telling me? Is there anything else you forgot? Another wife, perhaps? Charity knew that her words were barbed with scorn, but the thought that she had traveled all this way based on promises that seemed to be a pack of lies meant that she couldn't hold them back even if she wanted to. I wanted to explain everything face to face, Charity. Fred took his hat off and twisted it in his hands. It's not that I set out to deceive you, I just haven't found the right moment. His words trailed off, sounding lame even to his own ears. Well, I'm listening. This is your moment to tell me the truth, Charity retorted. She glanced around at the ranch again, not seeing the beauty that had delighted her so much just moments earlier. Now it felt isolated and forbidding. Long shadows were creeping toward them as the sun sank behind the mountains, and she shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She glared at Fred, feeling cross with herself that she had been duped by a dream, when the reality was shaping up to be something very different. Go back inside with Alicia, please, John, and take your sister with you. Fred gently squeezed Clara's hand and passed her over to Alicia. I've got some explaining to do if Charity will let me. Does that mean she won't be our new ma after all, Pa? I'm sorry I spoiled everything. I didn't mean to, but John and I were too excited, and now I've messed it all up. Tears started to roll down Clara's cheeks, and she craned her neck to look longingly back at Charity, stumbling as Alicia led her back up the steps onto the porch and into the house. Clara's cheeks burned with the injustice of it all, and she felt her heart squeeze with pity for the little girl. Fred might have been less than honest in his letters, but the children didn't deserve to be upset by this terrible situation that was unfolding. Will you walk across the meadow with me? Fred said quietly, wanting to buy himself a few minutes to think how to phrase what he had to say. I suppose it won't harm. It would be nice to see a bit of the ranch just this once before I return to New York. Fred gestured to the grassy track that led past the barns, and they walked side by side in uncomfortable silence until the creek came into view. There was a wooden seat on 2 upturned logs on a low hillock next to the edge, positioned perfectly to look over the bend in the creek where the boughs from an overhanging tree trailed on the water's surface. On any other day, Charity would have found it romantic, but now it felt as though it was mocking her hopes of happiness and love. Go on, then. Charity sat at the farthest edge of the seat to make sure there was a gap between them. Fred sighed heavily, looking toward the distant mountains for inspiration. John and Clara are my children. I think I got that already, Charity interrupted. What I don't understand is why you didn't tell me about them. Fred sighed again, risking a look at her. He could see the hurt in her brown eyes, and he jumped up, pacing back and forth for a moment, not wanting to see the pain he had caused. My first wife, Lauren, was taken by the Lord almost a year ago. It was nothing. Just a simple cut on her leg. But the wound festered, and the end. It was so quick I never had a chance to save her. He shook his head at the memory of it. Blood poisoning, the doctor said. 1 week she was with us, and the next week John and Clara were motherless. Charity could hear the grief in his voice. Why didn't you tell me, Fred? I was happy to come out west, but I said to my friend on the way here, I hoped I wouldn't be with someone just for convenience, someone who secretly loved someone else. Goodness knows if I'd wanted that, I could have stayed in New York. Because for the first time in months, I found myself looking forward to something, Fred replied. He sat down at the other end of the seat and twisted to face her. As much as I love Alicia and my children, it's lonesome out here running the ranch by myself. Lauren and I worked well together, and there was nothing she couldn't do, oftentimes better than any man. I can tell you still love your wife very much, Charity said softly. How can we be man and wife when your heart is already given to another woman? I can't stay here. It wouldn't be fair. But we're already married, Fred replied with a shrug. I have to move on from Lauren, now that she's gone, but I admit it's harder than I thought it would be. She was my first true love, you see. He kicked a pebble with the toe of his boot and had the grace to look shamefaced. I understand that what I've done is not how I was raised to behave, and I'm sorry. I don't have enough money right away, but as soon as I do, I'll give you enough to get back to New York, if that's really what you want. Charity fell silent, imagining what her parents would say if she returned with her tail between her legs within a few short weeks of leaving. The letter she had left for them on her dresser had explained in no uncertain terms that she refused to marry for a business arrangement, not now that she had found someone who loved her in Blossom Creek. The bitter irony was that Fred's offer of marriage had turned out to be every bit as businesslike as what Theodore had offered her, except at least Theodore hadn't lied and hidden that fact from her. You're right, Fred. I'm trapped here. I'd be the laughingstock of Mama's society friends and damaged goods as far as ever getting married again. Papa would probably never forgive me for bringing the family name into disrepute. Charity blinked back the tears that threatened as she thought of Fiona and Bessie, who had only ever wanted her to be happy. So it looks like you've gotten yourself a caretaker for your children, if nothing else. Her voice sounded weary with resignation, making Fred feel guilty all over again. Give me time, Charity. That's all I ask. Lauren is no longer here. Charity stood up to show that she had heard enough. Your wife might not be here in person, Fred, but the look on your face tells me she's the woman who still very much fills your heart. I'll care for your children, but please don't dangle the promise of love to me when it's clearly not true. I don't think I could bear that. Dashing the hot tears of disappointment from her cheeks, Charity ran back toward the barn, leaving Fred to follow in her wake. Am I destined to always be unloved? The thought felt like a bird trapped in a cage, fluttering in Charity's mind as she leaned against the rough wall of the barn in the shadows to gather her thoughts. It was obvious to her that Fred was still besotted with his first wife, and she was a poor second best. But the worst of it was that, in spite of everything that Fred had revealed, there were feelings growing inside of her that felt dangerously like attraction. She was falling for a man who would never be able to love her back, and the thought of how lonely that would be threatened to engulf her like a dark wave and drag her into a pit of despair. What choice do I have, though? Become a society outcast, A woman with a murky past back in New York? Or stay at the ranch and hope that one day Fred can learn to love me for who I am? I have to find a way to make this work. Charity looked at the warm glow of the lamps in the windows of the ranch and came to a decision. She would make the best of things for a few months and then see if anything had changed. She knew she only had herself to rely on, but reckoned that maybe this was a test from the good Lord to see what kind of woman she really was, and she was determined to give it her best shot. Chapter 10. Come on, Clara. Don't be a lazybones. Pa said, if we helped Charity with the chores this morning, we could all go on a picnic to the river later on. John's loud whisper, just as dawn was breaking, filtered through the wall between Charity's bedroom and the room next door where the children slept, pulling her awake. All right, John Hopkins, you're being mighty bossy when it's usually you who won't get up. Clara's chirpy reply, sounding just like when Alicia scolded them, brought a smile to Charity's face. Clara might have not long turned 6 years old, but she was as feisty as they came and didn't take any nonsense from John, even though he constantly reminded her that he was almost a full year older than her. She swung her feet onto the rag rug, wiggling her toes, and opened the patchwork drape that hung at the window to look at the view. The first shafts of sunlight were stealing across the paddocks, slanting low and bathing the scene in dusty golden light. In the distance, she could see Fred striding toward the horses with a halter slung over his shoulder. He stopped at the fence and put one foot up on the bottom rung, waiting for the horses to trot over. Blaze, his stallion, was first, nuzzling Fred's hand for the treat he had pulled from his jacket pocket. Next was Suki, the broodmare, followed by Jet, the colt she had birthed several years before. Even from this far away, it was plain to see that Fred loved his horses. He moved with the slow confidence of a skilled horseman, swinging himself over the fence and running his hand up Blaze's neck to calm him before slipping the halter over his head and vaulting effortlessly onto his back. Suddenly, the morning calm was split by a shrill whinny, and Charity was horrified to see Blaze rear up, raking the air with his front hooves before bolting across the paddock at breakneck speed. Fred, be careful. Charity's heart was in her mouth, and without a second thought, she threw open the window to shout her warning for him to take care before realizing that it was what Fred wanted. She saw him kick his heels into Blaze's sleek flanks, urging him on even faster, and the stallion sailed over the gate, thundering up the track with Fred on his back toward the distant meadows up the mountain. Charity's pounding heart gradually slowed to its normal pace. She had glimpsed Fred's face as Blaze had jumped the gate, and his expression had been one of pure joy, lost in the thrill of the moment, away from all the responsibilities of running the ranch and providing for everyone there. I wish he would look at me that way. The thought caught Charity off guard, and she gave a wry smile to her reflection in the fly-speckled mirror hanging on the wall as she buttoned up her dress and braided her hair, ready to start the day. And why on earth would a man who still loves his late wife and only wants you here to look after his children do that? She muttered quietly to herself, coming back to her senses with a jolt. In the weeks since she had arrived, Fred had been carefully courteous to her at all times, but it felt as though he had retreated behind an impenetrable wall of politeness. The gentle humor and warmth she had started to see in his letters had all but vanished since their talk on the day she had arrived, and she wondered whether she would ever truly get to know the real man behind the cool facade. He seemed to be avoiding her, leaving early in the morning and returning, dog-tired at night, just in time to eat and head off to bed. But now and again, she had caught him looking at her with a conflicted expression on his face, part hope and part fear, as if she was a cornered animal whose reaction he couldn't gauge. Her thoughts drifted back to a few days earlier. As per usual, Fred had been up before dawn, hastily eating a bowl of oatmeal topped with cream from their milking cow, then quickly draining his cup of coffee. He had bid Charity a terse farewell when she had bustled into the kitchen to help Alicia start the morning chores. Don't take it personally. He always gets worried at this time of year, Alicia had explained. It doesn't take much to lose a newborn calf to a mountain lion. If it happens a few times, the lion can get a taste for it and go on a killing spree, which would be devastating for the ranch. It can be the difference between having enough cattle to sell or not, to see us through the winter. It happened once when Fred was young, and he was so upset to see the mauled calves, he vowed he would make sure it never happened again. "I wish I could do more to help," Charity had replied, feeling helpless. She had noticed how tired Fred looked, but knew that she would probably be more of a hindrance than a support if she offered to go up to the high summer pastures with him. And in spite of Alicia's comment, it was hard not to take Fred's taciturn moods any other way than personally. "Well, now that you're learning to ride Suki, you'll be more help to him outside, I'm sure. There ain't much use for someone who can't ride a horse in these parts, but Fred tells me you're a natural." Charity hadn't been able to hide her surprise. "Fred told you that? He scarcely says a word to me when he's teaching me, other than to correct what I'm doing wrong. But he always speaks so kindly to his animals." She busied herself with stoking the fire to boil water for doing the washing, remembering the shiver of longing she had felt when she had overheard the gentleness in his voice when he handled the young colt, breaking him in. He was masterful, yet soft at the same time, and when she saw him stroking the colt's neck, she wondered what it would be like to be held in those same work-worn hands, feeling safe and loved. Alicia had looked at her with a shrewd expression, noticing the sudden hope that had flared in Charity's eyes at her comment. "It might seem like Fred loves his animals more than the people around him, but don't be fooled," she murmured. "It's just his way of protecting his heart." It was tough for him when Lauren died. He blamed himself, even though there was nothing. "Charity, can I help you today? John's helping Pa brand the cattle later, and he said I'm too little for that job." Clara's question, as she burst into the kitchen, interrupted Alicia, and that was the last she had said about the matter. But Charity hadn't been able to get the conversation out of her mind since. It was as if Alicia was telling her that Fred wanted more from his relationship with Charity, but something was stopping him. For the last few days, since that hint from Alicia, Charity had tried to be more attentive, hoping that it might break him from his self-imposed loneliness. But if anything, he had been even more distant than usual. A tap at her bedroom door snapped Charity from her thoughts, and she opened it to see Clara excitedly hopping from one foot to the other. "Can we do our chores faster today, Charity? Me and John really want Pa to come on the picnic later, but he's been so grumpy these last few weeks, he might not want to come." Her green eyes, the image of Fred's, clouded with worry, and Charity took her hand to reassure her. "Of course we can, sweetheart. We'll feed the chickens first, and then take all the rugs out to beat the dust off. And after that, you can help me bake a special treat for the picnic. What do you think we should do?" "Pa likes apple pie better than anything," Clara said, already forgetting her worries. "He said Mama made the best apple pie he'd ever tasted, but I think he would like yours just as much, especially if we make it together." Alicia met Charity's eyes over Clara's head as she bustled around preparing breakfast for them. "Make sure you add a good pinch of cinnamon and a dusting of sugar on the top, and Fred will be a happy man," she chuckled. "It was always Fred's favorite since he was the same age as you, Clara." Charity smiled her thanks at Alicia's guidance. She had rarely cooked back in New York because Bessie had done it all for them, and she appreciated Alicia's patient guidance as she gradually took on more of the cooking for them all. "I'm just grateful to be able to rest my weary bones now and again. I ain't no spring chicken anymore," she chuckled, rubbing her aching feet as she sat in the rocking chair next to the stove. Charity had worried about intruding into what had always been Alicia's domain, but Alicia had been generous in her encouragement. It was obvious that domestic work was all new to Charity, but she wasn't afraid of hard work, and she admired her determination to care for the children to the best of her ability, even though they weren't her own. She could tell that the shadow of Lauren was never far from Charity's mind, and her heart squeezed with pity for the way Fred seemed unable to let the past go. The rest of the morning flew past, and Clara kept up a constant chatter about everything she loved about Buck Ranch, making Charity laugh out loud on more than one occasion, as she related various mishaps that John had had as he learned to follow in Fred's footsteps. John thinks he can ride better than me, but when he went to visit Luke, he fell off his mule right in the dust, and that mule just stood there and hee-hawed like he was laughing at John for being like a sack of corn on his back. Clara giggled louder as John blushed a fiery red at the memory. "Well, what about that time you fell in the river and Pa had to wade in to get you just because you were chasing a butterfly?" he retorted. "We haven't had time to learn to swim yet," he explained to Charity solemnly. "Ma always said she would teach us." "But," he sighed, suddenly looking close to tears, "Pa promised to teach us this summer instead, but I guess he's been too busy." "Why don't I speak to your Pa and suggest I could teach you instead?" Charity replied, after a beat of silence. "He's right. It's important to know how to swim, especially with a river on the property. I learned when I was your age, so it could be something I could help take off his shoulders." "Oh yes, please." Clara jumped up and clapped her hands. "Thank you, Charity. I love having you here so much. It's so much better than it was before you came." "Shush now, Clara. That's no way to behave at the table," John said hastily, taking on the role of the man of the house. He shot Clara a frown, and Charity could tell that he felt torn by what she had said. "Let me ask your Pa, and if he'd rather do it himself, then maybe a little nudge will help remind him," she said brightly. "How about we get things ready for the picnic now, so that when he gets back, we can leave straight away?" She stood up and cleared the table, pressing a hand gently on Alicia's shoulder for her to rest a while longer. "How can I ever be a part of this family when I'm not their real mama?" She bit her lip to cover her sadness. In spite of promising herself not to compare herself to Lauren, it was hard not to with so many reminders of her presence. She didn't blame the children for wanting to talk about their ma, but the more Charity heard, she knew she could never really fill the void that Lauren had left in the Hopkins family. She sounded like a wonderful woman, but the more Charity heard about her, the more she felt herself to be lacking. No matter how long she stayed, part of her knew that Fred would never consider her to be the kind of wife a rancher really needed, born and bred to the land the way Lauren had been. Chapter 11. "Easy, Blaze. Whoa there, boy, let's take it steady." Fred tightened the reins, and he felt his horse check himself underneath him, instinctively knowing that now was not the time to gallop back to join his herd. Fred's heart lifted as the homestead buildings came into sight, and he laid a soothing hand on the calf that was draped across the pommel of his saddle. He could feel the animal's shallow breath beneath his palm, and he sighed heavily. "Please spare this poor creature, Lord. Give me a chance to nurse him back to health, even though he's lost his ma." Moments later, he jumped to the ground and handed John the reins, with instructions to put Blaze out to graze once he had washed the sweat off his flanks. John led Blaze to the water trough, while Fred carried the calf into the stall that he always kept made up with soft straw bedding for just such a crisis. "Is everything all right, Pa?" Blaze's hoofbeats had alerted the household to his return, and Clara and Charity appeared in the barn entrance. "Has there been an attack?" Clara darted forward and opened the stall door, gasping at the sight that greeted them. The calf had deep lacerations down his side, and dark blood was oozing out. "Oh my, Fred, what happened?" Charity knelt down in the straw next to the calf and stroked the calf's head. The poor animal's eyes bulged with fear, and she felt tears welling in her eyes. "Will he live? What can I do to help? I saw the tracks in the dirt last week, but I hoped it wouldn't come to this," Fred replied darkly. "It's a mountain lion attack. It killed the mother while she was birthing the calf, but by some miracle he survived." He wiped his hand warily across his brown, and Charity's heart went out to him. "I'll get salt water to bathe the wounds." Charity hurried away, returning a few minutes later with a bundle of clean rags and a bucket of hot water. "You can leave them there. I'll take care of him," Fred said, gesturing to the corner of the stall. Charity put the bucket down and hovered, not wanting to distract him. "I could help you with this. I used to help in the sanatorium of the poorhouse." Fred waved her offer away. "It's fine, I've got it covered. You've never done this sort of thing on a ranch before, so?" He bit his words back, knowing how ungrateful they sounded. Pa, can we still have the picnic after you've made the calf better? Clara stood at his side with a pleading look on her face. We made a surprise for you, didn't we, Charity, because you've been working so hard? He looked at the hope in her eyes and nodded, tousling her hair quickly. Sure thing, honey. Give me a bit of time to make this little fella comfortable and have a wash, all right? I've been thinking about the picnic all day, and I reckon I'm hungry enough to eat the biggest hunk of steak you ever saw. Is that my surprise? He added with a wink. No, Pa, it's a... Clara clapped her hand over her mouth with a giggle. You have to wait and see, else it won't be a surprise. You nearly tricked me into saying. She skipped over to Charity and took her hand. Let's pack the baskets and get Pa's surprise ready. I'm so excited. This is the best day of the summer since you got here. Fred deftly cleaned the calf's wounds and pulled some straw down from the rack to prop him up. The calf was breathing fast and shallow, which was never a good sign, but he knew there was nothing more he could do now but wait and see which way it would go. Now that he had the barn to himself again, he took a moment to sit on the wooden bench just inside the doorway. Why can't I be nicer to her? He muttered to the pigeon that pecked the wheat grains at his feet. She's trying her best, but every time I speak, it comes out wrong. He shook his head, irritated with his own failings. He had seen the hurt cloud her eyes when he had rebuffed her offer of help before she quickly hid it by making herself busy with Clara. Now that he was getting to know her better, he was starting to read her expressive face better. The problem was that it meant he could see how much his careless words bruised her heart. But every time he went to speak more kindly to her, he was racked with guilt that it was a betrayal to Lauren. The farm cat jumped down from where she had been sunning herself in the hayloft, sending the pigeon clattering into the air. She wound herself around Fred's ankles, and he bent to scratch her head. If Ma was still alive, she would have been tempted to whoop my backside, he muttered. The cat looked at him with impassive yellow eyes. I need to try harder, huh? That's what you're thinking, isn't it? He chuckled. He stood up and stretched. The truth was that if he didn't pull himself together and make an effort, Charity would probably leave to go back to New York, and he would only have himself to blame. Moments later, Fred bent beneath the water pump, dousing himself in cool, fresh spring water. As he dried his tousled hair, his thoughts drifted back over the last week. He had noticed Charity doing her very best to get accustomed to their way of living at the ranch. And more than once, he had been startled to find his heart skip a beat when the sun caught the glints of copper in her hair, or he saw the curve of her waist as she bent to tend to the fire. She was a beautiful woman, even in the plain gray dress she now favored, instead of the fancy ones she had brought from New York. He hadn't felt like a man in love for a very long time. But something about her presence was starting to resonate like a faint echo of what he remembered about being a husband again. He closed his eyes and imagined pulling her into his arms. Her head would nestle beneath his chin, and when she looked up at him with those dark eyes of hers, he knew it would make him forget all his worries. But... I'm sorry, Lauren, he gasped in a hoarse whisper. I'm sorry I couldn't save you, and I'm sorry I'm making such a mess of everything. I wish, he swallowed the lump in his throat. What was the use of wishing things had been different? Alicia had asked him yesterday, fixing him with her wise gaze that seemed to see right into the heart of what he was struggling to understand himself. I just need more time, he had muttered in reply. You were raised better than this, Fred, she had countered. Don't let this opportunity slip through your fingers while you're too busy punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault. She had shaken her head, and Fred knew that she was right. If he wasn't careful, he would lose Charity as well as Lauren. Are you ready, Pa? We're waiting. Clara's voice drifted across from the porch, and he waved to say that he was coming. Behind her, he could see that Charity had changed into the green dress she had worn when he met her off the train, that he had thought showed off her figure so well. He saw Clara slip her hand into Charity's, skipping along next to her, and he came to a decision. He would do his best to make Charity feel more welcome. After the last few weeks, it was the least he could do to make up for his lukewarm attitude, that was no fault of her own. "You made this apple pie, Clara? It's delicious," Fred said, scooping his last spoonful into his mouth and groaning with delight. "But there's something different about it that I can't quite put my finger on. It's Charity's secret ingredient, Pa." Clara slid another slice onto Fred's plate with a grin and sat down on the blanket next to him again. "A secret ingredient, huh?" He looked quizzically at Charity and raised his eyebrows. "A lady never tells," she replied enigmatically before bursting into laughter. "Oh, all right then, it's a spoonful of honey. Bessie, our housekeeper in New York, used to swear by it, so I added some to see if you would be able to taste the difference." Fred smiled back at her, noticing that her cheeks were flushed from the fresh air and a smattering of freckles dusted her nose, making her look even more attractive. "Ma never used to make it that way," John interjected. Fred saw Charity's expression fall. "I think this is as nice as anything I've ever eaten, though, son, don't you?" The silence stretched between them while John and Clara jumped up to paddle at the edge of the river. "You don't have to apologize for the children wanting to talk about their ma," Charity said quietly, packing the plates back in the basket. "It's only natural, and I know they don't mean anything by it. I'm not their mother, and I never will be. That's all there is to it." Fred let out a gusty sigh and leaned back on his elbows. "I know it must be hard for you to fill her place, but the children will get used to it one day, I'm sure." "I don't doubt that," Charity replied, not meeting his eye. "It's not the children I'm worried about," she added, "and I don't expect to fill Lauren's place, by the way. I can't ever be her." Fred shot her an apologetic look, feeling wrong-footed again. "Are you still going to teach us to swim this summer, Pa?" John flopped down on the blanket next to them, shyly handing Charity a bunch of buttercups that he had picked from the riverbank. "It'll be fall soon enough, and we'll miss our chance if we don't do it in the next few weeks, won't we, Pa?" "That sounds like a wonderful idea," Charity said, smiling at Fred. "You're so lucky having the river here, and it would be a lovely thing to do on a hot day. Ma promised she was going to teach us, but that was before." John's words trailed off, and he plucked at a loose thread on the blanket. "I'm too busy for that, son. Maybe next year, huh? Since that mountain lion came, I'll have to spend more time up in the summer pastures." John nodded slowly, and his disappointment was clear to see. "I could teach them," Charity ventured. "I learned to swim when I was about your age, John. I'm not the most stylish, but it will be good enough to get you started, and then your father can teach you better next summer. That would be fun, wouldn't it?" No. Fred's expression had darkened, and Charity felt the good mood of the picnic evaporate. "But I'd be happy to teach them, Fred. It would be something nice I can do for them that we can all enjoy together." "It's not your job to do that," Fred snapped. "And you shouldn't be swimming in the river, none of you. Is that clear?" He jumped up and thrust his hands in his pockets. "I need to get back and check the calf. Help Charity clear up, children, and then get ready for bed. It's getting late." He strode off into the gathering dusk, kicking out at a pebble on his way. "What's wrong with Pa?" He heard Clara's urgent whisper, and fought the urge to run back and scoop the three of them into his arms. The evening had been going so well, and it was the first time he had felt a real connection with Charity. What was I supposed to say? I can't take that risk. The angry thoughts battered his mind, fueled by his memories of that fateful, sunlit day last year. Lauren had loved to swim in the creek, and she had been so excited to teach John and Clara to learn how to swim with her, too. But on that terrible day, she had been swept into a boulder under the surface that had got washed down in the last storm. It was that boulder that had caused the cut on her leg, and a week later, she had died in his arms. He hunched his shoulders and hurried toward the barn, trying to outrun his memories. If he could have found the words to explain to Charity, he would have done so, but all he knew was that he couldn't take the risk of losing her or his children the same way that he had lost Lauren. He slammed the door of the barn closed behind him, relieved to be alone again with his thoughts. "How are you doing, fella?" He put his hand on the calf and pulled it away again quickly, feeling the heat of a rising temperature. "Guess I'm spending the night out here with you then," he muttered, sitting down on the straw next to the struggling animal. The barn was quiet, other than the sound of the calf's labored breathing, and Fred let his mind drift back over the picnic again. He remembered how Charity had wanted Clara to take the praise for the apple pie to bolster the little girl's confidence, and the way she had patiently listened to John as he named all the wildflowers for her. "I'm a fool," he whispered into the silence of the barn, shaking his head. As he drifted off to sleep, the last thing he saw in his mind was the way Charity's brown eyes shone when she laughed, and the tendril of hair which curled on the back of her neck like a kiss curl, where it had escaped the tortoiseshell combs holding her hair in its bun. He imagined that her sparkling eyes had gazed at him with love and understanding before slipping into a troubled sleep that was filled with desperate dreams of Charity calling for help and him not being able to get to her. Chapter 12. "This way, Buttercup." Fred whistled for the dog, and she gamboled toward him, with her pink tongue lolling out of the side of her mouth. "Reckon Luke sold me a dud. Some rancher's mutt you make," he chuckled, scratching the top of her head. After the disastrous picnic, Fred had woken up the next morning in the barn to find a blanket tucked over him and a fresh cup of coffee cooling on the shelf. Scrambling up to check the calf, he was surprised to see it was up and eating, with fresh dressings on its wounds. "You need to let Charity help you more," Alicia had said shortly afterward, sliding another cup of coffee in front of him at the kitchen table. "She might have come from the city, but I can tell she learned a lot from her volunteering at the poorhouse. You'll never have a willing wife by your side at Buck Ranch if you don't let her try, even if she does make the odd mistake." She had stood next to him with her hands on her hips until he had given her a reluctant nod. "You're right. I messed up again. I'll try harder," he had promised. "You didn't mess up too bad," Alicia had shot back at him with a grin. "Reckon you're both as stubborn as each other. If you were still a youngster, I'd knock your heads together to get some common sense back in there." The last couple of months had seen an uneasy truce spring up between Fred and Charity. Alicia could see they were like two bears circling around each other, each one waiting for the other to make the first move. She wondered how long it would take for Fred to realize that it had to be him. His only gesture had been to fetch a puppy back from Luke's the week after the picnic, to make up for the fact that he flatly refused to let Charity teach Clara and John how to swim in the creek. Alicia had to admit that it had taken the children's minds off their disappointment, but it still didn't hide the fact that Fred was pushing Charity further away each time he let her believe that she wasn't half the woman Lauren had been. Buttercup snatched up a stick and raced to Fred, dropping at his feet and barking for him to throw it for her. "All right, you're persistent. I'll give you that. One more time, and then you'd better get back inside before Clara wonders where you've gone." He threw the stick back toward the ranch house, and the dog bounded after it, grabbing it and then loping off to the porch where Clara had appeared. The dog was like her shadow, and she doted on her, which went some way toward easing his guilt about not letting the children learn to swim this year. He caught sight of Charity as she hurried down the steps with a basket over her arm. As he watched the way she tucked her hair behind her ear as it lifted in the morning breeze, and her sweet smile as she waved for him to wait a moment, he felt his heart skip a beat. Lately, she had taken to bringing some food out for him to take with him for the day, so that Alicia could save her legs, which had become more arthritic than ever. He found himself lingering over his morning chores, looking forward to the moment she would appear and the few minutes she spent in his company. "Looks like the weather's on the turn," he said, by way of a greeting. "One thing you'll learn about Blossom Creek and these parts is that fall can bring some terrible storms when you least expect them." He shrugged his buckskin coat on and lifted the collar, looking at the slate-gray clouds gathering overhead. "I think we're in for a storm today, in fact, so make sure you stay indoors." "I made fresh bread," Charity replied, lifting a fragrant bundle from the basket and handing it to him. The scent wafted out from the linen wrap, making Fred's mouth water. "You've got to keep your strength up, working this hard." She glanced up at him through her lashes, thinking yet again how handsome his weather-beaten face was, and the way his slow smile started in one corner of his mouth, making her pulse quicken. A sudden gust of wind whipped her dress around her ankles in an eddy of dust, and she shivered. "You take good care of us, Charity," Fred said softly. Without thinking, he pulled her into the leeward shelter of the barn and lifted her shawl where it had slipped off her shoulder. His fingers brushed against the skin on her neck like the caress of a butterfly, and he felt a shiver of longing race through him as her eyes widened with surprise. "It's the least a wife can do," she muttered, stumbling back from his unexpected touch. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." Fred tucked the food into his pocket and buttoned his coat quickly to cover his confusion. Part of him wanted to touch her again, to fold her into his arms and never let her go. But they were still sleeping in separate rooms, and his conscience wouldn't allow him to take that step while there was still so much unsaid between them. Charity turned to go. "I liked it," she said quietly, but the wind whipped her words away, leaving Fred thinking he must have misheard. "Why don't we make a plan to go into Blossom Creek soon?" he said hastily. He realized that he didn't want her to leave and go back indoors. "I need supplies, and you could meet your friend Rebecca. I know we're kind of stuck out here. It would be nice for you to have some company, I reckon." "What do you say?" Charity spun around to face him, and he was shocked to see the look of shame on her face. "I can't do that." Her voice was laced with regret. "But I thought you would like to see her." Fred felt as though he was walking on quicksand, not understanding what he had said wrong. "Don't you see?" Charity shook her head in frustration. "Why do you think I haven't written home to my sister Fiona or wanted to meet Rebecca?" 2 red spots had appeared on her cheeks, and she folded her arms like a barrier between them. "Our marriage is a sham, and I don't have the courage to see how happy they are in theirs. It would be too painful. I want to be a proper wife to you, Fred, but you'd rather live in the past." Fred felt his stomach lurch as the truth hit him like a sledgehammer. He had asked for Charity to give him more time when she had arrived, and every day since, by his actions. But he had never given any thought to how lonely that might make her feel. Charity looked at him steadily, hoping that he might let the wall around his heart crumble, but his expression was unreadable. "I guess I'll see you tonight then," she said wearily, turning on her heel and running back to the porch. "It won't be for much longer," he cried. Fred saw Alicia watching them from the window, and her face was etched with frustration. A sudden squall of rain stung his eyes as a streak of lightning split the sky. "Stay inside while I'm gone. There's a big storm coming," he shouted. Charity turned to look at him one last time before disappearing into the house, and he hoped she would heed his advice. She wouldn't be used to the sort of storms they had out west, and the last thing he wanted was for her to get caught up in it while he was away for the day checking the cattle. Did I ever tell you about the time Fred stayed out for 3 days and 3 nights looking for a heifer that got lost? Alicia looked up from the quilt she was sewing ready for winter. The storm had been raging overhead for hours since Fred had left, and the drum of rain on the roof made it feel cozy inside. "What happened? Did he find her?" Charity's knife glinted in the lamplight as she chopped up vegetables for the stew she was making. One thing about Fred is that he can be mighty stubborn. Sometimes that's a good thing, and other times it ain't. Alicia shot Charity a shrewd glance. He was always like that, even when he was a little boy. When his pa was teaching him how to lasso, when he scarcely came up higher than his pa's britches, he'd get up before dawn and practice until his hands bled. Clara came to sit next to the fire, stroking Buttercup's ears as she listened to Alicia's story. "Well, I guess that's a handy trait to have for running a ranch," Charity replied. She knew what Alicia was trying to tell her, but her pride was stopping her from seeing Fred in a good light. Stubborn and loyal, that's what he is, sometimes to a fault. Alicia held up her needle in the lamplight to thread it. "And when he comes to his senses, which he will, you'll understand it's a good trait to have in a husband as well." Charity's cheeks flamed as she realized that in his own way, Fred had been trying to give their marriage a chance, but she had been too stubborn herself to acknowledge it. Just last night, she had come in from closing the chickens in their coop to find that he had lit a fire in her bedroom to take the chill off. And last week, there had been a jar of meadow flowers on her nightstand. Clara had whispered sleepily as Charity tucked her up in bed that she had seen her pa putting them there. Didn't he tell me in his letters that he didn't have a fancy way with words? The thought slid into her mind, pricking her conscience. She remembered how hollow Theodore's words had turned out to be. He had said the right things, but his actions had turned out to be traitorous. By comparison, Fred was clumsy with what he said sometimes, by his own admission. But lately, his actions had shown him to be kind and thoughtful, now that she could put her pride to one side and admit it. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. With a start, Charity recalled the words she had read in her Bible that same morning. It was as if the Lord had been showing her what she hadn't been able to see. All this while she had been so busy feeling envious of what Lauren had meant to Fred that she hadn't given Fred a proper chance. The fire hissed as raindrops rattled down the chimney, and Charity looked around with fresh eyes. Clara's head was bent over her sampler in concentration as Alicia taught her to sew, and John was humming softly as he cleaned Suki's saddle for her, buffing the leather to a soft sheen. I think I need some air. Charity felt her head start to spin and hurried out to the porch. I've been so foolish, holding on to a grudge. The thought spurred her to a decision. As soon as Fred returned, she would have a proper talk with him. She was ready to be his wife in every way. She just needed to know that he felt the same way. And if he did, they could have a new start. A jagged bolt of lightning split the sky, and Charity's chest constricted with fear. Fred had been gone for hours, and even though Alicia had assured her that he would have taken shelter, worry niggled at her. Shouldn't he have come back by now? She hurried back inside, snatching up one of Fred's spare buckskin coats and shrugging it on. It's wild out there, and I'm worried about the horses. I'm going to check on them. You stay here. No sooner had the words left her mouth than a deafening thunderclap roared overhead, so violently that Charity could feel it pulsing through the ranch house. The wind screamed with renewed ferocity, and Buttercup leaped up and shot past Charity out onto the porch, her ears flattened with terror. Come back, Buttercup. Clara jumped up and ran outside, skidding to a halt on the steps as the sheeting rain cascaded from the roof onto the muddy ground in front of them. She's heading for the river. John raced past Charity after the dog. Stay here, Clara. I'm going to get her. He slithered in the mud, scrabbling to get traction before disappearing into the deluge. No, John, you mustn't go to the river. It's too dangerous. You'll be swept away. Alicia's shout could scarcely be heard above the noise of the storm. She clutched Charity's arm, her face lined with terror. He can't swim, Charity. What are we going to do? Without a second thought, Charity ripped the coat off again, knowing it would weigh her down too much as soon as it got wet. Look after Clara. I'm going after them. With a quick squeeze of Clara's hand to reassure her, she dove down the steps and ran after John and Buttercup as fast as her feet would carry her. Don't let them die. Clara's sobbed entreaty was the last thing she heard as the wind and rain buffeted her, soaking her to the skin in an instant. Chapter 13. We've got to get home, Blaze. I have a bad feeling about this storm. Fred tucked his head low as Blaze loped down the track. He held the reins loose, knowing that, in this weather, he had to trust his horse to keep his footing on the treacherously wet ground. Blaze sank on his haunches, slithering down the steep-sided ravine, but as the sky lit up again with a fork of lightning, Fred could see that they were making progress, even if it was slow. Please keep them safe, Lord. Keep them safe, and I promise I'll make things right. The words thrummed through Fred's mind on repeat, and he fixed his eyes on the distant homestead that came into sight every couple of minutes when the rain eased momentarily. Next to the track, the creek had swelled into a raging torrent of foaming water, crashing over rocks and smashing through everything in its path. As they got to where the land started to flatten, Fred urged Blaze into a gallop. There was something about the violence of this storm that was filling him with alarm, and he couldn't put his finger on it until he suddenly realized what it was. She's gone out in the storm, I know it. The words were snatched from his mouth, but he knew them to be true. Charity had grown to care for Buck Ranch almost as much as he did, even though she had never said as much. And with a sinking feeling in his heart, he knew with absolute clarity that Charity would have gone outside to check on the animals. Faster, Blaze! She's in trouble. I can feel it in my bones. He kicked harder, and Blaze sprang forward, the sinews straining on his powerful neck as he did his master's bidding. The mud flew up from his hooves, and they covered the ground at breakneck speed. Just as they rounded the final corner, the blood froze in Fred's veins. Through the scything rain, he saw Charity wading into the river and diving into the raging torrent. Just ahead of her, he could see John's arms flailing and Buttercup scrambling out of the water further down, pulling herself to safety. It was clear that John had gone in after the dog, but she had managed to rescue herself. No! No! Fred's scream was ripped away in the wind, and he saw John's head sink beneath the surface. He kicked harder, but he knew Blaze would never get there fast enough to save him. I'm coming to get you, John. Keep looking at me. Charity's shout reverberated as John gasped for air, and she cut through the water with powerful strokes, pulling him back up to the surface. I've got you, she yelled. Inching in slow motion, she dragged him from the sucking, swirling current into the shallows, heaving him out of the water. As she reached the side, Charity gave John one final push, sending him sprawling forward onto the grassy bank where she knew he would be safe. He crashed onto his knees and retched, purging the muddy water from his body. Pa, over here! John's feeble cry felt like a dagger in Fred's heart, and he vaulted off Blaze's back, running the last stretch to John's side. You're safe. Thank the Lord. He clutched John to his chest, and they both twisted round to try and pull Charity up onto the grass with them. Hold on to me, Charity. Grab my hand. Fred lunged forward, but it was too late. Just as their fingertips touched, a fresh wave of water surged down the river, sending her tumbling backward into its murky depths. Charity! Don't leave me. As the dark water closed over Charity's face, the last thing she saw was Fred's anguished expression as he called to her, and it was at that moment that she knew she loved him more than she had ever known possible. Shush, John. Don't wake her. Clara's girlish voice slid into Charity's mind like a distant echo, and she imagined the weight of the little girl settling into her lap with freshly washed hair, asking for a story. A sharp pang of longing ripped through her, and she wondered whether she would ever see Clara and John's dear faces again, that she had grown to love so much since coming to Buck Ranch. Bring Buttercup in, Pa! Perhaps she can lie on the quilt with Charity for a while and make her feel better. John's quiet voice eddied around the room, followed by the gentle patter of the dog's paws on the wooden floor. Charity tried to open her eyes, but it felt as though she had been asleep for 1,000 years, and her limbs no longer worked. She felt herself drifting in and out of awareness, and suddenly, the image of Fred's face, laughing at something she had said, floated into her thoughts. It felt like the warmth of a sunlit morning and seeing something beautiful for the first time ever, and in her mind, she returned his smile with one of her own. She smiled, Pa. Look, I'm sure she smiled just now. Clara's whisper was more urgent, snagging at the edges of Charity's dream and forcing her to wake up. Charity felt strong, warm fingers curl around hers, and the mattress beneath her shifted as someone sat on its edge. Gradually, she felt herself rising up through the depths of consciousness, and her eyes fluttered open. Oh, thank the Lord. Sweet mercy, you're going to be all right. Fred's face swam into view, and Charity blinked, wondering if she was still dreaming. Is that you? Charity's voice sounded hoarse to her own ears, and as she tried to lift her head, every part of her body resisted, sending darts of hot pain shooting through her. Lie still, Charity. We're all here, and you're safe now. Fred's deep voice was soft with concern, like when he spoke to his animals, and Charity couldn't help but smile again at the sound of it. You were right. We don't have storms like that in New York. I guess I should have listened to you, she croaked. She opened her eyes again and found herself gazing up into Fred's green eyes. Reckon we both should have done a bit more listening to each other, he replied. A smile of relief lifted the corners of his mouth. You gave us all a fright there, Charity. But I should have known you wouldn't let any of us come to harm. If it hadn't been for you, John would have, I dread to think what would have happened." Fred swallowed the lump in his throat, not wanting to put into words how close John had come to death. "Thank you for saving my life." Charity's eyes sought Fred's, and their gaze locked together. "No, thank you for saving us. I hope you're going to let the poor woman recuperate quietly." Alicia bustled into the room, carrying a tray of her herbal remedies, which she placed on the dresser. She had a fresh nightgown, warm from where it had been airing in front of the fire, draped over her arm, and the room filled with the comforting aroma of lavender. "Now then, shoo, the lot of you. Charity just needs to rest, and she'll be as right as rain." Her brusqueness covered the relief that they all felt, and Charity felt a surge of affection for the old woman who had been so kind to her since the day she had arrived. "And get that mutt out of here. She's caused quite enough trouble for one day." Alicia shook her head, giving the dog a quick stroke as Clara called her from the room. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Fred stood up, and his gaze lingered on Charity, taking in the purple bruises and cuts on her cheeks. He didn't want to let her out of his sight for one moment since he had come so close to losing her. "Better do as Alicia says," Charity said, with another chuckle. "We've got plenty of time ahead of us for everything else." She felt suddenly shy and realized she wasn't the only one as she saw Fred's cheeks flush. "I'll be right outside, just as soon as I've checked the horses. They're still a bit spooked, but you'd never have known we had such a storm just yesterday. The sun's shining again, and it's a beautiful day." He gave Charity one last lingering look before ducking out of the room and closing the door quietly behind him. "It's the worst storm we've had for as long as I can remember." Alicia pressed a cool compress to Charity's forehead, and she could see she was starting to feel better already. "Mind you, I reckon the good Lord got tired of waiting for you two to sort your differences out and thought he'd give you a helping hand." Her face creased into a smile as she saw Charity nodding. As the clock ticked on the mantel shelf, a shaft of sunlight filtered through the window, bathing the room in golden light. "I'm glad he did, Alicia," Charity replied with a smile. "Fred and I have a lot of catching up to do." "What are you doing out here? You should be resting." Fred saw Charity walking carefully toward him with a determined look on her face, and he hurried to her side. "It's been a whole week since the accident, and I've got to find my legs again somehow. That won't happen if I'm sitting by the fire, will it?" She grinned up at him, pleased to show off her progress. Her cuts and bruises were healing nicely, and her head no longer pounded when she stood up, even though she still felt a little weak. Alicia was like a woman possessed, feeding her the most nourishing foods she could conjure from the kitchen. And Charity knew she was well on the road to full recovery. "How's John doing? Has he gotten over his fright?" Charity stood next to Fred, watching John lead Suki, the mare, out to pasture in the distance. "He's made of strong stuff. He and Clara were more worried about losing you, after losing their ma." Fred's words petered out, and he bit his lip. "There's something I need to say. I've been thinking." They both smiled as their words tumbled out at the same time. "When I saw you being swept away in the river, everything suddenly became crystal clear to me, Charity. It wasn't that I didn't love you. It was that I was afraid of losing you. In a crazy way, I thought if I kept you at arm's length, I could somehow protect myself from the risk of ever having a broken heart. But I realized that it's no good because I do love you. More than you'll ever know." Fred's words came out in a flurry, and he clasped her hands in his, looking deep into her eyes. "I was going to say the same thing. I was stubborn and prideful because I wanted to be the only person you'd love. But I know that if it weren't for Lauren, there would be no Clara or John, and I love the three of you more than words can say. It was all I could think about in that river, and I almost lost the chance to tell you. Would you be my wife, Charity? In every sense of the word, to have and hold for the rest of our days." Fred's voice cracked with emotion, and he bent his head closer. "It would make me the happiest woman alive," Charity murmured, stepping toward him. She could feel the pulse of heat between their bodies, and every nerve in her body quivered with longing for this honest, handsome man who stood before her. Fred slipped his hand around her waist and pulled her closer. He paused for 1 second and then gently kissed her berry lips, tasting the sweetness of her love, and it was as if all the misunderstandings of the past few months had been forgotten. I love you, Charity Hopkins, and I always will. And I love you, Fred, and Clara, and John, and Alicia. Charity gave a muffled laugh as Fred bent to kiss her again. He looked deep into her eyes, and the passion sparked between them as she melted into his embrace, like coming home. Epilogue. Montana, March 1881. There's a letter for you, Charity. John burst through the door, stamping the snow from his boots. Let me see, Clara cried. She jumped up from the fireside and took it from her brother. Look how fancy the writing is. She traced the elegantly inked font on the front and hovered next to Charity as she quickly opened it. Fiona's an artist, and she always did have beautiful handwriting. Charity smoothed the paper out and tilted it toward the lamplight to read what her sister had written. Dearest Charity, I have so much news to tell you, I hardly know where to start. George has a new exhibition of his paintings in the Upper West Side, and there are also several of my own paintings on show, which is very exciting for me. The christening for baby Lottie is planned for the fall after the exhibition ends. I know you probably won't be able to take time away from the ranch to come, but if you could, it would mean the world, especially to Mama and Papa. If Fred, John, and Clara could come too, that would be even better. And George's Papa has offered to pay for first-class railroad tickets. Mama and Papa often speak fondly of you, and Bessie says to tell you to write more often because she misses us both being at home. Theodore married Phoebe Brandling and then caused a terrible scandal when there were rumors of a liaison with the housekeeper's daughter. What of your news, Charity? Please write again soon and tell me more about your life at Blossom Creek. It sounds like the quaintest place, even though you seem to work very hard on the ranch. I hope with all my heart that you are happy, and it's everything you dreamt of. You are always in my thoughts, Fiona. Charity sat back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment, remembering her old life in New York. She had no regrets other than wishing she could see her family. Do the letters from home make you feel sad? Clara clambered into Charity's lap and gave her a hug. No, honey. This is my home now. I just miss my sister sometimes, the same way you missed your ma when you lost her. I'd love to meet my new niece too someday. She stroked Clara's golden curls to show her that it was okay to talk about Lauren if she wanted to. There's something me and John want to ask Pa. It's a secret, but I promise we'll tell you this evening. Clara's eyes twinkled, and she jumped back off Charity's lap with a giggle. Well, that sounds mighty intriguing, Charity replied. But first, we need to collect the eggs, fetch the horses in, and get dinner ready. Reckon you can help me with all that? Uh-huh. You know how much me and John like to help you and Pa with the chores. And Alicia promised we could make a new dress with the fabric we got from Blossom Creek. It's going to be my best dress for Sunday school. The rest of the day passed by in the comforting rituals of ranch life that Charity had come to love so much. She had a new milking cow to halter train, and she was learning how to tend to their small flock of goats and sheep that she had suggested would be a good addition, as well as Fred's prize cattle. As the sun started to set, Alicia rang the bell on the porch to let everyone know that dinner was ready. Pa, walk with us. We need to ask you something. John and Clara ran through the snow to grab Fred's hand, steering him away from Charity. For a moment, Charity felt the echo of rejection that she was being left out of their conversation, but she quickly pushed the thought away. Those days had long gone, and she knew that she was as much a part of the family now as Lauren had ever been. She shut the barn door firmly, double-checking that the bolt was firmly across. Her sheep and goats would be bringing new lambs and kids into the world in a few weeks, and the last thing she wanted was for a bear to come prowling and get into the barn. Hurry up, dinner's ready. Alicia beckoned from the porch, and Charity felt her spirits lift. As much as she adored the balmy summer months, there was something very special about the cozy nights they spent by the fire. Especially when Fred chatted with her after the children had gone to sleep, sharing his hopes and dreams for Buck Ranch. As they gathered around the table, The lamplight cast a soft glow against the gathering darkness outside. Fred threw a couple of logs on the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and Buttercup snuffled in her sleep, stretched out on the rug on the hearth. "Beef stew and dumplings," Alicia announced. She ladled the fragrant, meaty stew into 5 bowls after they had said grace, and a comfortable silence descended as everyone tucked into their food. Suddenly, Fred cleared his throat. "Clara and John have something they want to ask you, Charity." He reached across the scrubbed tabletop and placed his hand over hers, giving it a squeeze. "Clara hinted at a secret earlier," Charity replied with an encouraging smile. "I've been on tenterhooks, wondering what it could be, all day." She winked at Clara and put her spoon down to give them her full attention. "Well, me and Clara, we want to ask you." John looked suddenly bashful and looked at Fred for reassurance. "We would like it very much." Clara jumped up, her eyes sparkling. "What John's trying to say is we would like to call you Ma because we love having you here, and we think it would be nice. Pa said that it doesn't mean we love our mama any less, and we think she would have loved you a lot too." She sat down again, holding her breath for Charity's response. Charity felt the tears gather in her eyes and blinked them away. "Your mama was a very special woman. I can tell that because of how special you both are." She turned to Fred, and a look of understanding passed between them. "It would be a very great honor for you to call me your ma now." She opened her arms, and Clara ran around the table, diving into them for a hug. "I think this calls for some extra dessert," Alicia cried. "I might just have made one of my special fruit pies," she chuckled. "Clara, John, come and help me and leave your ma and pa for a moment." She shot Charity a beaming look and bustled the children away. "Will you come and stand on the porch with me, Fred? I've got something of my own I need to ask you." Charity shrugged a shawl over her shoulders, and they went out to the porch together. "Now you've got me wondering. Is it anything to do with that letter that Luke delivered earlier?" Fred put his arm around her shoulder, and they stood for a moment to look at the view. The full moon was rising, and it cast a pale glow across the snowy landscape. Charity thought she had never seen it looking so beautiful. "Fiona and George have invited us to Lottie's christening in the fall, and they will pay for first-class tickets for us all to go to New York. But the thing is," Fred held up his hand to stop her, "you've made a lot of sacrifices for us, and I know how much it means to you, so if Luke agrees to look after the place, I'm sure we could go." He scooped her into his arms and gave her a mischievous grin. "Do you think New York is ready for the Hopkins family?" Charity giggled and shook her head. "Let me finish, cowboy. It won't be a good time for us to travel across the country because—" She leaned back and looked deep into his eyes before gently taking his hand from her shoulder and resting it on her belly. She gave him an impish smile as she watched the understanding dawn in his eyes. "We're having a baby? Is that what you're saying?" Fred's face split into a huge grin as Charity nodded. "Right about late summer, I reckon. So it's not so much whether New York's ready for the Hopkins family, but whether you're ready to be a papa again." Fred brushed her lips with a soft kiss before answering. "This is the best news you could ever have given me. Our family will be complete. You, me, John, Clara, and a baby of our own. I'm so happy I could burst." He pulled back and drank in every detail of her face, sending a prayer of thanks that the Lord had brought Charity into his life. Charity reached up and stroked his cheek, feeling the tiny flutter of new life deep inside her belly, and her heart filled with gratitude. "We made a few mistakes, but the Lord showed us the way, didn't he?" Fred nodded his agreement, knowing that their love would only grow richer and deeper in the coming years together. "But what about Fiona's invitation? Won't you be disappointed?" Charity gave a soft laugh. "Mama always said she'd like to travel, and Fiona said George would like some fresh inspiration for his paintings. I reckon a visit to Buck Ranch for both the new cousins to meet might be on the cards, don't you?" In the distance, an owl glided on silent wings over the sparkling snow. The moonlight caressed the ranch and the mountains beyond like a cloak of silver as Fred and Charity went back to the coziness of the fireside to share their good news. The end. Thank you for listening to this free audiobook, and we hope you enjoyed it. Martha Gillcrest writes clean romance stories that sweep you away to when times were simpler, with plenty of love and adventure to entertain you. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like it with a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. That way, you will always know when a new audiobook has been added for your listening pleasure.